Get out of my seat. People with random upgrades belong farther back. Claire's camel coat still covered 2A as Danielle calmly held up the boarding pass, proving it was hers. No one in first class spoke. Then Captain Bennett noticed the battered CM-17 brass tag on Danielle's tote, and the cockpit phone rang. He listened, went still, and ordered, "Nobody moves this aircraft." Claire had no idea what she had just set in motion. Get out of my seat. Danielle Carter stopped in the narrow first-class aisle of Meridian Crown Flight 417. For a second, she thought she had misheard. Morning rain crawled down the windows of Baltimore/Washington International Thurgood Marshall Airport, turning the terminal lights outside into long silver streaks. The aircraft door was still open behind her. Damp air drifted in from the jet bridge, mixing with the faint smells of coffee, citrus cleaner, leather, and jet fuel. Danielle looked down at her printed boarding pass. 2A. Then she looked at seat 2A. A camel-colored coat covered the leather cushion from armrest to armrest. The woman sitting beside it in 2B didn't move. She was white, perhaps in her late 40s, with carefully styled blonde hair, pearl earrings, and a cream blouse beneath a tailored navy jacket. A leather handbag rested by her feet. Her phone lay in one hand, displaying a Meridian Crown loyalty screen. Danielle kept her voice polite. "Excuse me, that's my seat." The woman finally looked up. Her eyes traveled over Danielle before they reached her face. White sneakers, simple charcoal jacket, dark slacks, faded canvas tote, no designer luggage, no assistant, no expensive jewelry except a small silver clip holding Danielle's curls low behind her head. The woman's expression settled into certainty. "No," she said, "it isn't." Danielle unfolded the boarding pass. "Seat 2A." The woman barely glanced at it. "People get moved around after upgrades all the time." A few passengers behind Danielle stopped shuffling. Someone's suitcase wheel bumped another person's shoe. The woman gestured vaguely toward the rear of the aircraft. "You probably need to check farther back." Danielle felt the words before she allowed herself to answer them. She knew that tone. It wasn't loud enough to be called openly cruel. That was part of its usefulness. It arrived wrapped in confidence, dressed as helpfulness, spoken by someone who expected the room to accept her version before anyone checked the facts. Danielle glanced again at her boarding pass. Her name was printed clearly beneath the flight information. Danielle Carter, Meridian Crown Flight 417, BWI to Newark, seat 2A. Nothing about the paper was uncertain. "I'm not looking for another seat," Danielle said. "I'm asking you to move your coat from mine." The woman's eyebrows rose. Behind Danielle, the boarding line had stopped completely now. An older black woman with silver-streaked hair stood near row 3 holding a small red carry-on. A businessman across the aisle lowered his phone. Another passenger pretended to reorganize something in an overhead bin while watching through the reflection in the polished compartment door. Nobody spoke. The woman in 2B leaned back. "My husband and I are sitting together." "Then where is he?" The question was simple. It seemed to irritate her more than an argument would have. "He's speaking with someone in the premium lounge. He'll be here." Danielle nodded toward the coat. "And your boarding pass?" The woman gave a small laugh. Not amused. Offended. "My husband is diamond status." Danielle waited. The woman apparently expected that sentence to settle the matter. When it didn't, she added, "We were told they'd take care of the seating." Danielle's gaze remained on her. "What seat is printed on your boarding pass?" The woman's jaw tightened. "What difference does that make if the airline already agreed to accommodate us?" "It makes a difference because you're covering the seat printed on mine." The older woman near row 3 shifted her grip on the red carry-on. Still, nobody intervened. Danielle felt something tighten beneath her ribs. Not fear. Something older. The exhausting recognition of having entered a conversation where evidence would somehow be required from only one side. She could have ended it differently. One phone call from Danielle could reach people whose calls were returned before the first ring finished. One surname spoken with the right context could change posture, vocabulary, even facial expressions. She hated that kind of respect. So she didn't reach for her phone. Instead, she held out the boarding pass. "Please look at it." The woman finally did. Her eyes landed on 2A. For half a second, Something changed, then disappeared. There must have been an upgrade error. Danielle almost smiled. The evidence had changed. The conclusion had not. What makes you think I was upgraded? The question hung between them. The woman's eyes flicked once more toward Danielle's clothes. That was answer enough. She picked up her phone. I don't have time for this. Neither do I. Then be reasonable. Danielle's fingers tightened slightly around the paper. What would reasonable look like? The woman pointed toward the rear cabin again. Let the crew find you another seat until they straighten this out. A soft exhale came from somewhere behind Danielle. She didn't turn around. What is your name? Danielle asked. The woman looked almost surprised. Claire Whitmore. Miss Whitmore. My assigned seat is underneath your coat. Claire's lips thinned. I'm aware of what you're claiming. I'm not claiming it. Danielle raised the boarding pass slightly. I'm showing it. The distinction quieted even the whispering behind her. Claire looked toward the galley. Where's the flight attendant? A black flight attendant in his 30s was helping another passenger near the forward closet. His name tag read Thomas Reed. He glanced toward them. Danielle saw him notice the coat. Saw him notice the boarding pass. Saw him recognize that something was wrong. But another passenger asked him a question, and he hesitated. That hesitation lasted perhaps 2 seconds. To Danielle, it felt longer. Claire saw it too. Thomas, she called, as though she already knew him. Could you please deal with this? Deal with this. Danielle had become the this. She inhaled slowly through her nose. On her shoulder, the faded canvas tote shifted against her jacket. The words Morning Star Community Kitchen had once been printed in dark blue across the front. Years of use had softened the lettering until only fragments remained. Attached to one strap was an old brass tag. It was scratched almost smooth around the edges, dull from years of handling. Nothing about it looked valuable. A person might have mistaken it for an old locker tag or a piece of forgotten industrial equipment. Stamped into its center were 4 characters. CM-17. Danielle touched it unconsciously with her thumb. The metal was cold. Ma'am, Thomas said as he approached, is there a problem? Claire answered first. Yes. This passenger appears to have been assigned our seat. Danielle looked at Thomas. My boarding pass says 2A. Thomas's eyes dropped toward the coat. Then the boarding pass. Claire leaned toward him. My husband is diamond status. We were separated after some last-minute change, and the lounge told us they'd fix it. I'm sure she's been upgraded and the system hasn't caught up. Danielle watched Thomas carefully. He was listening, but he was listening to Claire first. Danielle held out her pass. Please verify the seat. Thomas took it. Of course. Claire gave an impatient sigh. Can we do this without delaying everyone? Danielle turned her head slightly. The aisle behind her was filled with faces, some annoyed, some curious, some uncomfortable. Nobody asked Claire to remove the coat. Nobody asked why a passenger with a boarding pass showing 2A was still standing. The older woman with the red carry-on met Danielle's eyes for one brief second, then looked down. That hurt more than Danielle expected. Not because she needed rescuing, because silence had a way of making one person's certainty feel larger than another person's proof. Thomas examined the boarding pass. Ms. Carter, give me one moment. Thank you. Claire crossed her arms. Danielle remained standing. Rain tapped steadily against the oval windows. Then the cockpit door opened. A tall white man in a captain's uniform stepped into the forward cabin. He looked to be in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, silver beginning at his temples. Reading glasses rested inside his shirt pocket beneath his wings. Captain David Bennett. He was speaking quietly to a gate employee when his eyes moved toward the stalled aisle. First he noticed Claire, then Danielle. Then the coat spread across 2A. His gaze lowered. For the briefest instant, it stopped on Danielle's canvas tote. More precisely, on the scratched brass tag hanging from its strap. CM-17. Bennett stopped walking. Danielle noticed. The captain's expression changed so slightly that nobody else seemed to catch it. Recognition? Confusion? Memory? His eyes lifted to Danielle's face, then returned to the tag. Claire followed his gaze but saw nothing worth noticing. She turned back toward Danielle with a thin smile. "If you're so certain," she said, "then call someone." Danielle said nothing. Captain Bennett stared at CM-17 for 1 second longer. Then he turned and walked toward the cockpit. And for the first time since Danielle had entered the aircraft, she wondered whether that battered piece of brass had just remembered something before anyone else in the cabin did. Hours before Claire Whitmore covered seat 2A with her camel-colored coat, Danielle Carter had been standing behind a scratched stainless steel counter in West Baltimore, pouring coffee for people who had no reason to care who her father was. Rain had started before sunrise. It washed the brick row houses in a cold gray light and gathered along the curb in shallow streams. City buses hissed at the corner, their brakes sighing as adult workers climbed aboard beneath umbrellas. Across the street, the yellow windows of Morningstar Community Kitchen glowed against the wet morning. Inside, everything smelled warmer. Coffee, toast, eggs, cinnamon, damp coats drying near old radiators. Danielle wore the same white sneakers she would later wear onto Flight 417, though the toes were already spotted with rain. Her charcoal jacket hung over the back of a chair. The faded Morningstar canvas tote rested beneath the serving counter, the scratched CM-17 brass tag tapping softly against one metal leg whenever someone brushed past it. "Don't give me that look," Walter Green said. Danielle turned. Walter was 71, a retired transit mechanic with thick gray eyebrows and hands permanently marked by decades of grease, steel, and Baltimore winters. He sat at the end of a long folding table, with one leg stretched carefully beneath it. A workplace injury from a part-time maintenance job had left him moving slower than he liked, which meant he had become suspicious of anyone offering help. Danielle carried a hot tray toward him anyway. "I didn't give you a look. You gave me the same look my doctor gives me." "What look is that?" "The one that says I'm about to be told something I don't want to hear." Danielle set down scrambled eggs, toast, and oatmeal. "You need to eat." Walter stared at the tray. "See? There it is." Danielle smiled. "You want me to take it back?" Walter pulled the tray closer. "Let's not get reckless." She laughed and reached for his coffee. "No charge for the refill." "That's good, because I wasn't paying." "You never do. That's why I like this place." Walter grinned. Nobody in the room called her Ms. Carter. Nobody asked about Carter Meridian Group. Most of the regulars knew Danielle only as Danielle, the woman who appeared before sunrise twice a month, tied on an apron, carried trays, wiped tables, listened to complaints about bus schedules, and disappeared before lunch. That anonymity was not an accident. She liked rooms where kindness couldn't purchase anything. Near 7:30, the breakfast rush thinned. Danielle carried a plastic bin of cups toward the kitchen when she noticed Denise Walker standing beside the front window. Denise was 64, a home health aide who had worked overnight with an adult client in East Baltimore. Her navy scrubs were wrinkled from the shift, and exhaustion had settled beneath her eyes. "You waiting on the 22? Danielle asked. Denise nodded. "Supposed to be here 8 minutes ago." Danielle looked outside. Rain hammered the sidewalk now. "You have an umbrella?" Denise lifted a grocery bag. "I have optimism. That won't keep your hair dry. At my age, optimism is lighter to carry." Danielle reached beneath the counter and picked up her black umbrella. Denise immediately shook her head. "No." "Yes. You're flying today. I'll be inside most of the day. And when you leave the airport, I'll figure it out." Denise frowned. "Danielle." Danielle placed the umbrella in her hand. "Take it. You always giving something away." "It's an umbrella. Today." Danielle paused. Denise's voice had softened. "People get used to taking from somebody who never asks for anything back." For a moment, Danielle didn't know what to say. Then she smiled. "Bring it next Thursday." Denise pointed at her. "You better be here." "I will." The bus appeared through the rain, headlights pale in the gray morning. Danielle held the door while Denise hurried toward the stop beneath the umbrella. A minute later, the bus pulled away. Danielle remained beneath the kitchen awning, watching red taillights disappear down the wet street. West Baltimore had taught her a lot about disappearance. Businesses disappeared. Jobs disappeared. People with money promised investments and disappeared. Respect disappeared fastest when people believed you had nothing they needed. She had been 24 when she learned that lesson in a way she never forgot. Carter Meridian had not always been the empire business magazines described now. There had been a year when a financing crisis nearly broke the company Marcus Carter had spent decades building. Credit tightened. Contracts stalled. Partners who once returned calls within minutes suddenly needed weeks. For a time, the family sold the West Baltimore row house, where Marcus had built his earliest freight schedules at a second-hand kitchen table. Danielle remembered standing beside him during one meeting in a downtown loading facility after the sale. She had been 24, already an adult, already old enough to recognize contempt. Marcus had arrived early in a plain work jacket because he had spent the morning inspecting one of the company's freight yards. A visiting executive entered, saw him near the service entrance, and handed him a cardboard box. "Delivery goes around back." Marcus looked at the box, then at the man. Danielle had felt heat rush into her face. Her father had simply asked, "What's your name?" The executive gave it impatiently. Marcus handed the box back. 10 minutes later, they sat across from each other at the negotiating table. Danielle never forgot the man's face when someone introduced Marcus as the founder of Carter Meridian. His voice changed. His shoulders changed. Even his smile changed. Danielle had hated that transformation more than the original insult. Later, in the car, she asked her father why he hadn't embarrassed the man. Marcus had looked through the rain-streaked windshield. "Because knowing my name shouldn't have been the price of treating me right." Those words stayed. Years later, Danielle could afford almost anything she wanted. She could travel with assistants. She could use private terminals. She could have Carter Meridian security meet her at every curb. Instead, she carried a canvas tote from a community kitchen. She wore comfortable sneakers. She booked ordinary commercial flights whenever her schedule allowed. Not because she wanted to pretend she wasn't wealthy, because she refused to perform wealth simply to make strangers comfortable respecting her. By 8:15, Danielle had removed her apron. Walter was preparing to leave. She saw him struggling with the zipper of his rain jacket and walked over. "I can do it." "I know. Then why are you standing there?" "Because knowing you can do something doesn't mean I have to watch you fight with it for 10 minutes. Walter grumbled, but let her align the zipper. "There." He looked down. "You're bossy." "So I've been told." "Your father know you spend mornings taking orders from people like me?" Danielle smiled. "He'd say you're easier than his board of directors." Walter laughed so loudly, the two volunteers turned. Danielle picked up her tote. The brass CM-17 tag swung from the strap. Walter touched it with one finger. "You still carrying this old thing?" "Always." "He ever tell you to replace it?" "He knows better." Walter nodded. "Some things look cheap because people don't know what they cost." Danielle looked at him. Walter was already reaching for his cane, apparently unaware that the sentence had landed anywhere unusual. Outside, another bus groaned to a stop. Danielle helped him through the door, waited until he was steady beneath the awning, then returned for her jacket. By the time she reached BWI, the rain had followed her across Baltimore. And now, standing in the first-class aisle of Flight 417, she heard her father's old words again. "Knowing my name shouldn't have been the price of treating me right." Claire Whitmore's coat still covered 2A. Thomas Reed still held Danielle's boarding pass. Passengers still watched. And Captain David Bennett had just disappeared toward the cockpit after staring twice at the battered brass tag on Danielle's tote. Claire leaned back in 2B. "You know," she said, "this would be much easier if you simply let the crew handle it." Danielle looked at her. The morning at Morning Star felt suddenly far away. Walter's laughter. Denise beneath Danielle's umbrella. Warm yellow light against rain. Rooms where nobody needed a surname before offering someone a chair. Danielle touched the silver clip in her hair. Then she lowered her hand. "I am letting the crew handle it," she said. Claire glanced toward the rear cabin. "Then maybe you should stop blocking the aisle." The words struck deeper than Danielle allowed her face to show. Once again, the person standing where she had every right to stand had somehow become the obstruction. Thomas looked uncomfortable. "Ms. Carter, I'm going to verify this. Please do." A second crew member approached from the forward galley. She was a white woman in her 40s, with a neatly tied scarf and senior purser wings above her name tag. "Rachel Morgan." She surveyed the stalled boarding line, Claire seated comfortably in 2B, Danielle standing beside the coat, and Thomas holding the boarding pass. Her expression changed into the efficient look of someone trying to solve a problem quickly. Danielle recognized that look too. Quick solutions often depended on deciding who would be easiest to inconvenience. Rachel stepped closer. "What seems to be the problem?" Claire answered immediately. "This woman won't move." Danielle said nothing for a beat. Around her, the cabin became quiet again. Rachel looked at Claire, then Danielle, then the coat covering 2A. Danielle waited to see which fact she would address first. Rachel turned toward her. "Ma'am, would you mind stepping forward into the galley for just a moment?" There it was. Not the coat, not Claire, her. Danielle felt the old wound open with almost surgical precision. She thought of Marcus holding that cardboard box years earlier. She thought of the executive's face after learning his name. She thought of Denise saying people could get used to taking from someone who never asked for anything back. Then Danielle looked at Rachel Morgan and understood that the hardest part of this flight would not be proving where she belonged. It would be refusing to let everyone else decide that her dignity was the easiest thing to move. Rachel gave her the practiced smile of someone who had spent years settling disputes before they disturbed a cabin. "Ma'am, if you'll just step into the galley for a moment, we can straighten this out." Danielle did not move. The aisle behind her had tightened into a quiet wall of luggage, expensive coats, and restrained impatience. Rain tapped against the aircraft windows. Somewhere farther back, an overhead bin slammed shut with a hollow thud. Danielle looked at Rachel, then at Claire Whitmore, then at the camel-colored coat still spread across seat 2A. "I'll step aside when you ask both passengers to step aside," Danielle said. Rachel's smile weakened. "I'm only trying to clear the aisle." "So am I." Danielle pointed gently toward the seat. "Her belongings are on the seat printed on my boarding pass." Thomas Reed stood beside Rachel with Danielle's ticket still in his hand. His eyes moved toward the coat again. Rachel noticed. "Thomas, let me handle this." He lowered the boarding pass slightly. "Yes, ma'am." Claire leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. "This is exactly what I was talking about. She's making something very simple, unnecessarily difficult." Danielle felt her fingers move toward the silver clip holding her curls. She stopped herself halfway. That tiny motion was the only outward sign that Claire's words had found a place to land. Rachel turned back to Danielle. "Ms. Carter, nobody is accusing you of anything." Danielle's gaze stayed steady. "I didn't say anyone was." The answer seemed to unsettle Rachel more than anger would have. Danielle had learned long ago that calm could expose the shape of a room. When she refused to raise her voice, other people had fewer places to hide their own assumptions. Claire gave a dismissive laugh. "Can we please stop pretending this is complicated? My husband and I were promised these seats together." Rachel glanced at her. "Mrs. Whitmore, do you have your boarding pass?" Claire lifted her phone. "My husband has the reservation details. He'll be here any minute." Rachel did not ask to see the screen. Danielle noticed that. So did Thomas. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Rachel looked toward the growing line. "We have boarding backed up into the jet bridge." A businessman behind Danielle muttered, "Some of us have connections." Another passenger sighed loudly. No one said Claire should move her coat. No one said Danielle's boarding pass already showed the answer. The silence was not empty anymore. It was pressure. Danielle could feel it pushing toward her from every direction. Be reasonable. Step aside. Make it easier. Let someone else decide. She thought of her father at the loading facility years earlier, standing in a work jacket with a cardboard box pushed into his hands because somebody had read his clothes before they read the room. She thought of Walter Green that morning saying some things looked cheap only because people didn't understand what they cost, and she thought of Denise Walker taking her umbrella into the rain. People get used to taking from somebody who never asks for anything back. Danielle extended one hand toward Thomas. "My boarding pass, please." Thomas hesitated, then returned it. "Of course." She folded it once along the original crease. "Thank you." Rachel's expression became more formal. "Ms. Carter, we need cooperation from everyone." Danielle looked directly at her. "Then ask everyone." The words were quiet, but the cabin seemed to hear them all the way to row 5. Rachel's face tightened. Claire sat straighter. Thomas looked down at the floor. For the first time, a woman across the aisle lowered her phone completely instead of pretending not to watch. Rachel took a slow breath. "Mrs. Whitmore, please remove your coat temporarily while we verify the assignments." Claire stared at her. "Excuse me?" "Just temporarily." "Why?" Rachel glanced at Danielle. That glance told Danielle everything. Even now, Rachel wanted the request to feel balanced rather than obvious. Claire placed one hand over the coat. "This is absurd. My husband and I were told these seats would be handled." Danielle said nothing. Claire looked at her as if waiting for a reaction. When none came, she turned toward Rachel. "You know what? Fine. Verify whatever you need to verify. But I am not moving my things until someone tells me where my husband and I are actually sitting." Rachel's mouth opened. Before she could answer, a gate supervisor appeared at the aircraft door. He was a white man in his early 50s with a scanner in one hand and a radio clipped to his vest. His name tag read Mark Ellis. He looked at the blocked aisle. "What do we have?" Rachel gestured toward Danielle. "Seat assignment dispute in first class." Danielle heard the phrase immediately. Seat assignment dispute. Not obstruction. Not passenger refusing to clear another passenger's seat. A dispute. 2 equal claims. Claire began talking before Rachel could finish. "My husband and I were promised 2A and 2B. She has some kind of conflicting pass." Danielle turned toward Mark. "My boarding pass says 2A. She handed it to him. He examined the paper. Then he looked at the coat. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're saying yours says 2A? Claire lifted her chin. "I'm saying the lounge told us they would correct our seating." "That isn't the question," Danielle said. Claire's eyes flashed. "I wasn't speaking to you." Danielle remained still. Mark cleared his throat. "Let's just scan the pass." He raised the handheld device. Thomas shifted slightly closer, watching the screen. The scanner passed over Danielle's barcode. A sharp chirp sounded. Then another tone followed. Lower. Longer. Mark frowned. He scanned it again. The same sound. Rachel leaned closer. "What does that mean?" Mark stared at the small screen. "Give me a second." Claire leaned into the aisle. "There. I told you something was wrong." Danielle's eyes stayed on the scanner. "What does it say?" Mark did not answer immediately. He tapped the screen twice. The device refreshed. For a moment, all Danielle could hear was the rain, the ventilation system, and the faint electronic beeping from somewhere near the cockpit. Thomas stepped nearer. "I've never heard that alert on a regular seat scan." Mark's thumb stopped. Rachel's voice lowered. "Mark?" He looked at Danielle, then at her boarding pass, then back at the scanner. His expression had changed. Not recognition. Concern. "Seat change locked," he said. Claire sat forward. "What?" Mark read the screen again. "Manual authorization required." A murmur moved through the first-class cabin. Claire's face brightened with sudden satisfaction. "I knew it." Danielle turned toward her. "Knew what? That your reservation wasn't normal." The sentence came out too quickly, too eagerly. Rachel looked from Claire to Danielle. Thomas did not. He was still staring at the scanner. Mark tapped into another screen. "There should be a reason code attached." Danielle felt something colder than anger settle inside her. She already knew the reservation carried protections. Her father's security team had insisted on them after an incident the previous year involving unauthorized access to executive travel records. Danielle had agreed only after they promised the designation would remain invisible unless somebody attempted to alter her itinerary. If the system was showing it now, then something had happened. Something more than a coat. Rachel held out her hand. "Ms. Carter, may I see your identification?" Danielle looked at her. "My ID was checked at security and again at the gate." "I understand, but with this flag, has Mrs. Whitmore shown you identification?" Rachel paused. Claire scoffed. "Oh, come on!" Danielle's voice stayed level. "Has she?" Nobody answered. The cabin seemed to shrink around the question. Rachel's professional composure hardened into defensiveness. We're trying to resolve a system issue. Danielle looked at the boarding pass in Mark's hand. No. You're trying to resolve me. Thomas's eyes lifted. Mark looked uncomfortable. Claire rolled her eyes. This is unbelievable. Danielle turned toward Rachel. Why does her claim become believable before my document does? No one moved. Not Rachel. Not Thomas. Not Mark. Not Claire. The silence was broken by hurried footsteps from the jet bridge. A man in a navy blazer appeared at the aircraft door, breathing hard and adjusting the strap of a leather briefcase. Claire stood halfway. Richard. Richard Whitmore, 51, stepped into first class with the irritated look of someone who had already spent too much time waiting. What is going on? Claire pointed toward Danielle. They've created a mess with our seats. Mark lifted the scanner. Mr. Whitmore, can I see your boarding pass? Richard pulled out his phone and opened it. Mark scanned the barcode. A clean, cheerful chirp sounded. He looked at the screen. Seat 2B. Richard nodded. Yes, that's right. Claire gave Danielle a triumphant look. And I'm 2A. Mark's face changed. He looked at Claire, then at Richard, then down at the scanner again. No, he said. Claire's smile disappeared. What do you mean, no? Mark turned the device so Rachel could see. Current manifest shows Richard Whitmore in 2B. Rachel leaned closer. And Claire? Mark's thumb moved once. He stopped. Claire Whitmore is assigned to 4C. For 1 second, nobody made a sound. Richard slowly turned toward his wife. Claire? Her face lost color. Danielle looked at the camel-colored coat covering 2A. The seat had never belonged to Claire. Not for 1 minute. Not on one screen. Not on one boarding pass. Yet Danielle had been the person asked to move. Claire swallowed. They told me in the lounge they could fix it. Mark looked down again. His expression tightened. That's the problem. Captain Bennett had reappeared near the cockpit door. What problem? Mark stared at the scanner. Someone tried. Danielle's gaze sharpened. Tried what? Mark looked up at her. To move you out of 2A. And suddenly the seat dispute was no longer about who belonged where. It was about who had already tried to rewrite the answer. Captain David Bennett stepped farther into the cabin. Explain. Mark Ellis looked down at the scanner again, as if he hoped a second reading might make the first one less troubling. Ms. Carter's assignment is still 2A, he said, but the reservation is locked against reassignment. The system is showing manual authorization required. Claire Whitmore seized on the only part that seemed useful to her. Exactly. So something is wrong with her reservation. Danielle turned slowly toward her. No. Something stopped someone from changing it. Claire's lips parted, but no answer came. Captain Bennett looked at the camel-colored coat still covering 2A, Mrs. Whitmore. Remove your coat. Claire stared at him. My husband and I were told, your assigned seat is 4C. The captain did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. Remove the coat. Richard Whitmore touched his wife's arm. Claire. She pulled away. I was told this would be handled. Richard lowered his voice. By whom? Claire ignored him. For several seconds, her hand remained pressed against the coat, as though lifting it would amount to admitting something larger than a seating mistake. Danielle watched without satisfaction. That surprised her. She had imagined, during moments like this in the past, that being proven right would feel clean. It rarely did. Usually it only revealed how much effort had been required to establish something that should never have been questioned. Finally, Claire snatched the coat from 2A. The sleeve dragged across the leather cushion. A metal buckle at the cuff struck Danielle's seatbelt latch with a sharp click. The seat was empty. Available. Hers. Yet Rachel Morgan extended one hand before Danielle could sit. Ms. Carter, please wait. Danielle stopped. The pain came so quietly that no one else would have seen it, even after the coat was gone. Even after the manifest had proven Claire was assigned to 4C. Even after Danielle's boarding pass had been accepted at the gate. She was still the one being told to wait. For what? Danielle asked. Rachel nodded toward Mark's scanner. The reservation lock. My seat is confirmed. The seat is confirmed. The security designation isn't. Thomas Reed looked up. Danielle turned toward Rachel. You asked me for identification 2 minutes ago. Yes. My government ID matched this boarding pass when I entered the airport. I understand. It matched again when I boarded. Yes, but now we have a protected seat flag. Danielle let the silence sit between them. And that makes me less verified than I was 5 minutes ago? Rachel's face tightened. That's not what I said. No, it's what you're doing. Behind them, someone shifted impatiently. A phone camera lowered. Another rose. The first-class cabin had become strangely still around a seat that now contained nothing but a crooked seatbelt. Thomas looked toward the crew tablet. Rachel, we can verify the gate acceptance. She gave him a quick glance. I know. I mean right now. Thomas. His mouth closed. Danielle saw the hierarchy in that one word. She also saw his discomfort. Captain Bennett turned to Mark. Can you pull the authorization reason? I'm trying. Mark tapped through several screens. Rain continued sliding down the windows. Outside, orange-vested ramp workers moved baggage carts beneath white airport lights, unaware that inside Flight 417 an entire cabin had stopped over 4 characters on a seat assignment. Mark frowned. It's not a normal customer service lock. Rachel stepped closer. What is it? It just says manual authorization required at this level. Claire gave a humorless laugh. So we're all being delayed because she has some strange reservation? Danielle looked at her. No. We're being delayed because you tried to occupy a seat that wasn't yours. I did not try to occupy anything. I was told the airline would accommodate my husband and me. Richard turned toward her. Claire, who told you that? She looked at him for the first time. The lounge. Who in the lounge? I don't remember his name. Richard's eyes narrowed. You were still there after I left? Claire hesitated. I went back to ask them to fix it. A small shift passed through Richard's face. Not anger yet. Concern. When? Claire folded the coat across her lap. Why does that matter? Mark stopped tapping. Because there may be a timestamp. Claire's gaze snapped toward him. Danielle noticed. So did Thomas. Captain Bennett did not take his eyes off Claire. Find it. Mark moved toward the gate podium just outside the aircraft door, where he could access a fuller reservation record. Rachel remained beside Danielle. Until we understand the lock, I still need to verify your identity. Danielle looked down at her boarding pass. The paper had softened along the fold from her thumb. Would you be asking Mrs. Whitmore for additional identification if the scanner had shown a warning on her seat? Rachel exhaled. This isn't about treating anyone differently. Danielle lifted her eyes. Then show me where you've treated us the same. That landed. Thomas looked away. Richard stared at the floor. Helen Price, still near row 3 with her red carry-on, watched Danielle with an expression that had changed from discomfort to something closer to regret. But she remained silent. Everyone did. Danielle reached into the inner pocket of her charcoal jacket and removed her driver's license. She held it out. Not because Rachel's reasoning had convinced her, because Danielle understood the difference between refusing humiliation and allowing someone to manufacture a story about non-compliance. Rachel took the card. Her eyes moved from the photograph to Danielle's face. Danielle Carter, yes. Rachel glanced at the boarding pass. Same name. Yes. Thomas spoke quietly. Same passenger who cleared the gate. Rachel handed the ID back. Thank you. Danielle returned it to her jacket. Now may I sit in my seat? Rachel hesitated. The hesitation answered before she did. Captain Bennett looked at her. Rachel? I want the security designation reconciled. Thomas's expression sharpened. But her identity is reconciled. Rachel lowered her voice. We don't know why the lock exists. That doesn't change who she is. Thomas, enough. Danielle heard something inside herself go very still. She could call Rebecca Foster. She could call Daniel Brooks. She could call her father's security office and have the reservation explained in seconds. She could say Marcus Carter's name and watch this cabin transform. She refused, because the moment she did, the lesson would become the wrong one. They would tell themselves they should have treated Danielle differently because she was important. She needed them to understand that the boarding pass should have been enough. Mark hurried back from the podium carrying a printed sheet. His face had changed. Captain Bennett saw it. "What did you find?" Mark stepped into the galley. "There's a secondary transaction." Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" Mark looked at Claire. A manual seat change request was entered against 2A. Claire sat very still. Danielle felt her heartbeat once, hard against her ribs. "When?" Mark checked the page. After Ms. Carter's boarding pass had already been accepted. Thomas looked at the cabin clock. So she was already on the aircraft. "Yes." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "Who entered it?" Mark continued reading. "Premium lounge terminal." Claire interrupted. "I told you. I asked whether we could sit together." Mark looked at her. This wasn't just a request to find 2 seats together. What was it? It specifically attempted to move Danielle Carter from 2A to 4C. The cabin went silent again. Richard slowly turned toward his wife. "Your seat." Claire's face tightened. It was an obvious solution. Danielle stared at her. There it was. Not confusion. Not a computer error. A solution. Claire had seen Danielle occupying something she wanted and decided Danielle was the movable part. Captain Bennett's expression hardened. Did that reassignment go through? "No," Mark said. "Why not?" Mark lifted the printed sheet. The system rejected it. Thomas stepped closer. "Because of the lock?" "Exactly." Mark read the notation aloud. "Do not displace." Rachel's eyes changed. The words carried a meaning she recognized. Captain Bennett did too. Danielle saw his gaze drop almost involuntarily toward her faded canvas tote, toward the scratched brass tag hanging from the strap. CM-17. Claire followed his eyes. "What is everyone looking at?" Nobody answered. Mark studied the transaction history. There are actually 2 attempts. Richard's head snapped toward Claire. 2? The first was entered before boarding. The second came after Ms. Carter scanned onto the aircraft. Claire gripped her coat. "They told me there was a chance." "A chance at what?" Danielle asked. Claire looked at her. "At sitting with my husband." "Your husband had 2B." "Yes." "And you had 4C." Claire's mouth tightened. Danielle continued quietly. "So the only thing that needed changing was me." Claire said nothing. Mark turned the page over. There should be an employee ID attached to the manual request. Rachel's shoulders stiffened. "Which department?" "Premium services." Thomas moved beside him. "Can you see the ID?" Mark squinted at the printout. "Lounge credential, BC-29. Rachel's face lost color. Thomas noticed immediately. "You know it?" Rachel did not answer. Captain Bennett's voice became quieter. "Rachel," she swallowed. "Yes. Who is it?" Rachel looked toward the open aircraft door. "Brendan Cole." Mark checked the record. 29. Premium services agent. Captain Bennett studied Rachel. "And why does that name concern you?" For the first time since she had entered the dispute, Rachel Morgan looked as though she wanted someone else to answer. Thomas stared at her. Danielle watched the realization forming before anyone said it aloud. Rachel finally took a breath. "Because I spoke with Brendan before boarding." The words seemed to lower the temperature of the cabin. Captain Bennett's eyes narrowed. "About what?" Rachel looked toward Claire, then toward Danielle, and in that instant, Danielle understood that the attempted change had not begun with a computer. It had begun with a conversation. Captain David Bennett looked at Rachel Morgan. "What did you tell Brendan Cole?" Rachel's hands came together at her waist. Before boarding, Premium services called about a diamond status couple who had been separated after a seating change. Brendan asked whether there was any flexibility in first class. And what did you say? Rachel hesitated. I said we could accommodate them if an eligible seat became available. Thomas Reed looked toward seat 2A, but it wasn't available. No, Rachel said. Claire Whitmore shifted in 4C, the camel-colored coat pulled tightly across her lap now. Richard remained beside the aisle, staring at his wife with the expression of a man trying to decide how much of the morning he had misunderstood. Captain Bennett continued. Did you authorize Brendan to move Ms. Carter? No. Did you authorize anyone to override a locked assignment? Absolutely not. Mark Ellis held up the printed transaction sheet. Then someone took your general instruction and pushed it farther. Rachel's jaw tightened. That's what it looks like. Danielle listened carefully. The language was already changing. General instruction. Pushed it farther. A routine accommodation gone wrong. She could hear the institution beginning to build a version that would fit neatly into a report. One employee had misunderstood another. A seat request had been mishandled. A system lock had prevented an error. Clean, contained, almost harmless. But Danielle remembered Claire's first look. The sweep from white sneakers to canvas tote. The certainty with which she had said Danielle was probably an upgrade. The coat on 2A before anyone had checked a thing. This had not begun as a software problem. It had begun with somebody deciding who looked easier to move. Mark touched the bottom of the printout. There may be additional notes in the premium services log. I can't see them from this device. Captain Bennett nodded. Have the lounge preserve everything. Claire leaned forward. Preserve everything? You're making this sound criminal. No one used that word, Bennett said. Well, you're treating me like I committed some terrible offense because I asked to sit beside my husband. Danielle turned toward her. You didn't ask me. Claire's eyes flashed. I didn't have to. I asked the airline. You asked the airline to move me after I had already boarded. I didn't know you'd boarded. Mark glanced at the timestamp. The second request came 5 minutes after Ms. Carter's scan. Claire looked away. Richard's voice was low. Claire, she snapped back at him. What? Did you go back to Brendan after we separated at the lounge? I told you I did. What exactly did you say? Claire's face hardened. I said we were Diamond members and that I wanted the seats we were promised. You weren't promised 2A. They said they would try. That's not the same thing. The rebuke was quiet, but it hit harder because it came from him. Claire folded her arms. This is ridiculous. We are wasting everyone's time over a seat that she hasn't even sat in yet. Danielle almost answered. Then she noticed Thomas looking at the crew tablet. His expression had changed. Rachel. She turned. What? There's another notation. Mark stepped closer. What does it say? Thomas read silently first. Then again. Passenger record shows protected travel status. Rachel moved toward him. What level? I can't see the full code. Captain Bennett's eyes sharpened. Does it say executive? Thomas scrolled. No. Just protected reservation. Do not displace. Claire gave a sharp laugh. So now she's some kind of VIP? Danielle looked at her. The irony was almost exhausting. 5 minutes earlier, Claire had insisted Diamond status justified bending the seating chart. Now another passenger's protected designation was somehow suspicious. Rachel turned toward Danielle. Ms. Carter, I need to ask whether you're traveling under any corporate security arrangement. Danielle's gaze stayed on her. I already gave you identification. This is different. How? Rachel lowered her voice. A protected reservation can be tied to security protocols, corporate travel, legal matters, executive movements. We need to make sure the person standing here is actually the protected passenger. Thomas looked at her. She cleared security. I know. She cleared the gate. I know. Her ID matches the boarding pass. Thomas. The warning returned. Danielle felt it before Thomas did. Rachel was not trying to humiliate her. That almost made it worse. She was trying to follow procedure after having already failed to follow the simplest procedure in front of her. Danielle's proof had been sufficient until the system revealed she was protected. Now the protection itself had become another reason to doubt her. She felt a dull ache behind her breastbone, the kind of pain that came from having to remain composed while somebody turned every confirmation into another question. Rachel spoke more gently. Ms. Carter, if you can tell us what organization placed the designation, we can resolve this faster. Danielle looked toward the open aircraft door. She could hear the rain hitting the jet bridge roof. She could call Rebecca Foster. Rebecca would answer immediately. She could call Daniel Brooks. He could have Meridian Crown's legal department speaking to this gate in minutes. She could call Marcus. The thought came and went quickly. No. Not yet. If she gave them the name now, everyone in the cabin would suddenly remember how to be careful, and none of them would have learned why they should have been careful before. Danielle folded her boarding pass again. I want you to verify the reservation using the same systems you would use for anyone else. Rachel stared at her. That may take longer. Then take longer. A frustrated voice came from row 5. Are we seriously holding up a flight over this? Claire looked toward the voice as though she'd been handed support. Exactly. Danielle did not turn around. Thomas did. He looked toward the passengers behind them, then back at Danielle. Something in his face shifted. Not courage yet, but shame. Mark's radio crackled. He lifted it. Ellis. Static. Then a voice from the gate. Premium lounge manager calling back. Brendan Cole is still on duty. Mark glanced at Bennett. Send him to the aircraft. Rachel stiffened. Is that necessary? Bennett looked at her. Yes. Claire sat upright. Why? Because his credentials entered the request. I already explained it. Bennett's voice remained calm. You explained your side. The cabin went quiet. That sentence seemed to take something Claire had been relying on and remove it from the room. Mark spoke into the radio. Have Brendan come down with his supervisor. Preserve the workstation activity log and all lounge notes tied to Whitmore and Carter. The reply crackled back. Copy. Claire's face had gone pale around the mouth. Richard noticed. What did you say to him? Claire looked at him. I told you. No. You told me what you asked for. I want to know what you said about her. Danielle's eyes moved toward Richard. Claire's posture changed. Why would I say anything about her? Richard didn't answer. He didn't need to. For the first time, Claire seemed to understand that the people around her were no longer trying to resolve the seating arrangement. They were reconstructing her choices. Thomas touched the tablet. Captain, there's a timestamp showing the protected lock activated when Brendan attempted the second change. Bennett looked at him. Meaning? The security system didn't create the conflict. Thomas looked at Danielle. It stopped it. Danielle felt the words settle. The system had not doubted her. People had. Rachel looked down at the screen. So the seat stayed assigned to Ms. Carter the entire time. Yes. Mark nodded. 2A never legally moved. Danielle turned toward Claire. The camel coat was now crushed against Claire's knees. No longer a flag, no longer a claim. Just fabric. Rachel looked at Danielle again. We still need to complete the security verification. Danielle's voice was tired now, but steady. Then verify it. Rachel frowned. You're not going to tell us who placed the protection? Danielle shook her head. Not until you finish checking what was already in front of you. For a moment, Rachel looked offended. Then Thomas spoke. She has a point. Rachel turned sharply. Thomas swallowed, but continued. We had her boarding pass before we had any of this. Nobody interrupted him. She was 2A before the lock, before the security flag, before the second request, before any of us knew anything about her. Danielle looked at him. Thomas met her eyes. It was the first time someone in uniform had stated the obvious without being forced to. Claire's voice cut through the silence. This is becoming theatrical. Helen Price, still seated near row 3 now, looked up. Her expression had changed. Danielle saw it. The older woman's mouth tightened. Her eyes moved from Claire to Rachel, then to the coat. She knew something. Danielle could feel it. But Helen said nothing. Not yet. Footsteps sounded on the jet bridge. Fast. Approaching. Mark turned toward the aircraft door. Rachel's shoulders stiffened. Captain Bennett stepped into the aisle. A young white man in a Meridian Crown lounge blazer appeared at the entrance with his supervisor beside him. His face was pale. His name tag read, Brendan Cole. Claire leaned toward him immediately. "Brendan, tell them what you told me." Brendan stopped. His eyes went first to Claire, then to Danielle, then to the printed transaction sheet in Mark's hand. Whatever answer he had expected to give disappeared from his face. And before he spoke, Helen Price rose slowly from seat 3D. I heard what she said before any of this started. Every head in first class turned toward her. The silent crowd had finally found a voice. Helen Price stood beside seat 3D with one hand resting on the top of her red carry-on. At 68, she had the steady posture of someone who had spent decades walking into rooms where panic was already waiting for her. Before retirement, Helen had worked as a respiratory therapist, and years of hospital corridors had taught her that the first person to speak clearly could change what everyone else believed was happening. Until now, she had said nothing. That fact showed in her face. Captain Bennett turned toward her. "Ma'am?" Helen swallowed. "I heard what Mrs. Whitmore said when Ms. Carter first reached the row." Claire's expression hardened. "Excuse me?" Helen did not look at her. She looked at the captain. She told her this section was for full-fare first-class passengers. She said somebody who'd been randomly upgraded should go somewhere more appropriate. A murmur moved through the cabin. Not loud, but different from the earlier impatience. This time, the sound carried recognition. Claire stood halfway from 4C. "That is not what I meant." Helen finally looked at her. Her voice stayed even. "I didn't tell them what you meant." The cabin went still. "I told them what you said." For the first time that morning, Claire Whitmore seemed to have no immediate answer. Danielle felt something loosen behind her ribs. Not relief, exactly. Relief would have implied that Helen's words made the original treatment acceptable now that someone else confirmed it. What Danielle felt was simpler. She was no longer the only person carrying the first version of the story. Helen glanced toward her. There was apology in the look. Danielle did not make her work for forgiveness. She simply nodded once. Helen drew a breath and continued. "I was standing right there when Ms. Carter showed her boarding pass. I saw 2A on it." Rachel Morgan's eyes lowered. "And I saw the coat already covering the seat," Helen added, "before Ms. Carter said anything beyond asking for it to be moved." Thomas Reed looked toward Claire. Mark Ellis did the same. Claire crossed her arms. "You're making an innocent conversation sound ugly." Helen's mouth tightened. "I've spent too many years hearing people call something innocent after they find out witnesses were listening." That silenced the row again. Brendan Cole remained near the aircraft door with his supervisor beside him. His pale face had gone even whiter. Captain Bennett shifted his attention to him. "Mr. Cole," Brendan straightened. "Yes, Captain. You entered the manual request against 2A?" Brendan glanced toward Rachel. Then Claire. "Yes." "Why?" Claire answered before he could. "Because I asked him to help us sit together." Bennett did not look at her. "I asked Mr. Cole." Brendan's supervisor, a gray-haired woman in her 50s, folded her arms but said nothing. Brendan swallowed. Mrs. Whitmore came back to the lounge after her husband left for the gate. Richard looked at Claire. She avoided his eyes. "She said there had been a mistake with their seats," Brendan continued. "She said Mr. Whitmore was in 2B, and she was still in 4C. "And what did you tell her?" Bennett asked. "That 2A was occupied." "Assigned," Thomas corrected quietly. Brendan nodded. "Assigned." Danielle noticed that correction. One word, but an important one. Assigned meant the seat was not floating around waiting for someone powerful enough to request it. "What happened next?" Bennett asked. Brendan hesitated. Claire's voice sharpened. "Tell them exactly what happened." He looked at her. Something passed between them. Fear, perhaps, or the realization that whatever understanding they had shared in the lounge no longer existed. Brendan turned back to the captain. She asked whether the passenger in 2A had actually paid for first class. Danielle's fingers tightened around the folded boarding pass. Richard's face changed. "Claire," she looked at him. "I was trying to understand the situation." Brendan kept speaking. "She said the passenger looked like an upgrade." The words landed harder than Claire's earlier denials. Not because Danielle had not already understood what Claire meant, because now the assumption had a second location. It had traveled from Claire's eyes to Claire's mouth to Brendan's workstation, then into the reservation system. Danielle looked at him. What did you say? Brendan met her eyes for the first time. I should have said it didn't matter. Claire scoffed. Oh, please. But Brendan continued. I didn't. The honesty made the cabin quieter. I told her Diamond members were usually accommodated when possible. Rachel closed her eyes briefly. That was the language from their earlier conversation. When possible. Claire had heard softness in it. Brendan had turned softness into permission. And then? Bennett asked. Brendan rubbed one thumb against the side of his index finger. She said if the passenger had been upgraded randomly, she'd probably be fine in 4C. Richard stared at his wife. You said that? Claire's face flushed. I said she was traveling alone, and that moving one person made more sense than separating a married couple. Danielle spoke softly. You didn't know I was traveling alone. Claire looked at her. You were standing there by yourself, exactly. The answer hung in the aisle. Claire had turned appearance into information. Brendan looked down. I entered the first request. Mark held up the transaction sheet. Before boarding? Yes. And the second? Brendan's shoulders sagged. Mrs. Whitmore came back after she saw the boarding line moving. She asked me to check again. Claire shook her head. I asked if anything had opened. Brendan looked at her. You told me the woman had already gone on board and said that if I moved fast, the system could still switch her. Richard stepped back as if the words had physical weight. Claire, I was trying to sit with you. You were trying to move somebody who had already boarded. His disappointment was quieter than anger. It seemed to frighten her more. Claire looked around the cabin. This is being blown completely out of proportion. Nobody rushed to agree. That was new. A man across the aisle raised one hand. Captain Bennett looked at him. Yes, sir, I saw the coat too, the man said. I was already seated in 2D. He was white, perhaps in his early 60s, wearing a dark business suit and wireframe glasses. When Miss Carter arrived, Mrs. Whitmore had already spread it over 2A, and when Ms. Carter showed the boarding pass, Mrs. Whitmore didn't even really look at it. Claire turned toward him. You don't know what I looked at. He held her gaze. I know what I saw. Another fact entered the room, then another. A woman near row 4 spoke. I heard the part about upgrades. Someone behind her added, so did I. The crowd was changing. Danielle almost wished it felt better. Instead, it made the earlier silence heavier. These people had seen enough before. They simply had not believed seeing required anything from them. Helen seemed to understand that. She turned toward Danielle. I should have spoken when it happened. Danielle looked at her. Helen's eyes were wet but steady. I knew it was wrong. Danielle answered quietly. You're speaking now. Helen nodded. It was not absolution. It was permission to keep doing the right thing. Captain Bennett turned back to Brendan. Did Rachel Morgan authorize either specific reassignment? No, sir. Rachel released a breath. Brendan added, She said Diamond members could be accommodated if something opened. I treated that like permission to try. Rachel's relief disappeared. Thomas looked at her. So did Danielle. There it was. No single villain could absorb the whole failure. Claire had pushed. Brendan had bent. Rachel had created room for bending. Thomas had hesitated. The passengers had watched. Each choice had been small enough for the person making it to call it reasonable. Together, they had nearly rewritten Danielle's seat out from under her. Captain Bennett pointed toward the gate podium. Mark, I want passenger statements from everyone with direct knowledge. Preserve the lounge activity log, both manual requests, the gate scan, and the protected seat trigger. Mark nodded. I'll start the incident packet. Rachel straightened. Captain, we still don't know what organization placed the protected designation. Bennett's eyes moved to Danielle. For one instant, they dropped again toward the faded Morning Star tote. Toward CM-17. the same old brass tag he had stared at twice before entering the cockpit. Danielle saw recognition trying to surface in his expression. Not certainty. Memory. Bennett seemed about to ask her something. Then the cockpit phone rang. A sharp electronic tone cut through the cabin. Once. Twice. The captain turned his head. Thomas glanced toward the cockpit. Mark stopped writing. Even Claire fell silent. Bennett stepped through the cockpit doorway and lifted the handset. Captain Bennett. The cabin could not hear the voice on the other end, but Danielle watched Bennett's face. At first, professional concentration, then stillness. His eyes moved through the open cockpit door, past Rachel, past Thomas, past Claire, straight to Danielle, and then down to the scratched brass tag hanging from her canvas tote. CM-17. Captain Bennett listened for several seconds without speaking. Finally, he said, "Yes, she's here." Danielle's heartbeat changed. Bennett listened again. His posture became rigid. "No, sir. The aircraft is not pushed." Another pause. Then the captain looked at Mark Ellis and covered the receiver with one hand. His voice was quiet. "Absolute. Freeze boarding." Mark blinked. "Captain?" Bennett's eyes never left Danielle. "Nobody moves this aircraft until I clear it." The words traveled through first class like electricity. Claire's mouth opened. Rachel went pale. Brendan stopped breathing for a second, and Danielle looked down at the battered CM-17 tag beneath her hand, realizing that whatever Captain Bennett had remembered was no longer just a memory. Someone on the other end of that phone knew exactly what it meant. The cabin seemed to stop breathing. Rain whispered against the windows. The jet bridge hummed softly beyond the open aircraft door. Somewhere behind row 6, a suitcase wheel rolled an inch and bumped a seat frame, but no one complained. Captain David Bennett remained inside the cockpit with the handset pressed to his ear. "Yes," he said quietly. "I understand." Another pause. "No, the aircraft has not pushed." He listened again. Then his eyes shifted toward Danielle. Not Claire. Not Rachel. Danielle. The look on his face was different now. Earlier he had looked at the brass tag with the uncertainty of someone trying to pull a name out of an old memory. Now there was no uncertainty. Captain Bennett lowered the handset. "Mark." Gate Supervisor Mark Ellis stepped forward. "Yes, Captain? Stop boarding at the podium. Keep the jet bridge attached. No door closed, no pushback clearance." Mark nodded immediately. "Understood." A groan came from farther back. "Are you serious?" Another passenger muttered something about Newark connections. Claire Whitmore seized on the sound. "There. You hear that?" She looked around the cabin as though the complaints had elected her spokesperson. "This is exactly what I mean. We have turned one seating mix-up into a full operational delay." Danielle looked at her. Claire's coat was still crushed across her lap. The same coat that had covered 2A now looked smaller somehow. Its camel-colored wool creased where her fingers held it too tightly. Captain Bennett stepped out of the cockpit. "This is not a seating mix-up anymore." Claire's face tightened. "Then what is it?" Bennett did not answer her. He walked toward Danielle. Rachel Morgan moved slightly aside. Thomas Reed lowered the crew tablet. The captain stopped beside 2A. His gaze went directly to the brass tag hanging from Danielle's faded Morningstar tote. "Miss Carter." "Yes?" He pointed gently toward the tag. "May I ask where you got that?" Danielle looked down. The scratched piece of brass was no larger than 2 fingers laid side by side. Its edges had been rubbed smooth over the years. The engraved letters were dark with age. CM-17. My father gave it to me. Captain Bennett's eyes stayed on it. "When I started running the foundation." Something flickered across his face. "How long have you had it?" 8 years. Claire let out an impatient breath. "We're holding an aircraft because of an old luggage tag?" Bennett turned his head. "No one asked you to speak." The words were not harsh. That made them stronger. Claire went silent. Danielle touched the tag with her thumb. "My father told me it belonged to him before the company got big. That's all I ever needed to know." Captain Bennett looked at her. "Did he ever tell you where he carried it?" On field operations. Bennett nodded once. As I thought. Thomas frowned. What is it? The captain did not answer him immediately. Instead, he looked at Danielle again. Your father is Marcus Carter. It was not phrased as a question. The air inside the cabin changed. Danielle felt it. Rachel felt it. Mark certainly did. Claire's eyes narrowed as though the name had brushed against something she should recognize but couldn't quite place. Danielle did not smile. Yes. Captain Bennett drew a slow breath. Behind him, Mark's radio crackled. Gate to Ellis. Boarding stopped. Holding remaining passengers at podium. Copy. Bennett nodded. Then he looked at the cabin. No one leaves this aircraft unless I authorize it. No one boards until this review is complete. A businessman in row 5 raised his voice. Captain, how long are we talking? I'll update everyone when I have accurate information. But we're going to lose the slot. That possibility is understood. Claire leaned toward Richard. This is insane. Richard did not respond. His attention was fixed on Danielle. He had recognized the name. Danielle saw it happen slowly. First uncertainty, then calculation, then a small tightening around his mouth. Claire noticed. What? Richard kept his voice low. Carter Meridian. Claire stared at him. What about it? He looked toward Danielle. Marcus Carter founded Carter Meridian Group. Claire's face did not change yet. She still did not understand the scale. So? Richard's eyes hardened. So they handle freight, infrastructure, aviation services. Half the airport logistics contracts in this region touch them somewhere. Claire blinked. The color began to leave her face. Danielle looked away. This was the moment she hated. The moment when respect arrived too late and pretended it had always been nearby. Rachel's shoulders straightened. Her voice changed before she seemed aware of it. Ms. Carter, if we had known... Danielle turned. The unfinished sentence sat between them. If we had known. Rachel stopped herself. Good. Danielle said nothing. Captain Bennett looked at her as if he understood exactly why. Then he gestured toward the brass tag. CM-17 was one of Marcus Carter's early field credentials. Thomas looked at him. Rachel did too. Bennett continued. Long before Carter Meridian became what it is now, Marcus Carter was running emergency freight and aviation coordination out of Baltimore. Danielle listened. She knew pieces of that history. Not this piece. Bennett's eyes went distant for a moment. I was a first officer then, late 90s. We had a regional shutdown after a major systems failure. Cargo backups, ground equipment stranded, medical freight stuck between hubs. Marcus Carter showed up in a rain jacket with that tag clipped to his chest. He pointed toward CM-17. He worked nearly 20 hours without leaving the field. Danielle's fingers tightened around the brass. She could picture her father younger. Not in a boardroom, not behind dark glass. Out in the rain. Bennett looked at her. He wasn't famous. Most people there thought he was just another contractor. A quiet, almost smile touched Danielle's mouth. That sounds familiar? Captain Bennett understood the sentence. So did Thomas. Claire looked down. Bennett continued. He helped reorganize the entire ground flow that night. Got aircraft moving again. Got stranded freight where it needed to go. People who mattered later remembered his name. Danielle looked at the tag. Her father had never told her that part. To him, maybe it had simply been work. Captain Bennett's voice lowered. I remembered the tag because I saw it when I was 28 years old and never expected to see it again. The captain had been 28 then. Danielle noticed the symmetry without saying anything. Mark stepped closer. Captain, who called? Bennett looked toward Danielle first, then answered. Carter Meridian Corporate Security. Claire's mouth parted. Thomas's eyes widened. Rachel went still. Mark glanced toward the open cockpit, as though the telephone itself had become evidence. Bennett continued. They received an automated security alert when a protected passenger reservation, tied to their executive network, was targeted for reassignment after boarding. Claire stared at Danielle. You called them? Danielle shook her head. No. Claire frowned. Then how did they know? Thomas answered. The system trigger. Mark nodded. The do not displace lock. Captain Bennett looked at Claire. The request activated a protected travel alert. Claire's breathing became shallow. I only asked to sit beside my husband. Danielle looked at her. The excuse sounded smaller every time she repeated it. Bennett turned toward Mark. I want the complete transaction history preserved. Already started. Include the lounge communication, the manual request, the second attempt after boarding, the gate scans, and witness statements. Rachel stepped forward. And crew notes? Bennett looked at her. All of them. Her face tightened. There it was. The review would not stop at Claire. The silence would have a record too. Danielle felt no satisfaction in Rachel's discomfort. Only relief that the truth might finally be written without needing her to hold every piece of it herself. Claire rose halfway from 4C. This is going too far. Captain Bennett looked at her. Sit down, Mrs. Whitmore. I have done nothing dangerous. No one said you had. Then why are you treating me like some kind of security threat? Bennett's expression stayed calm. Because a protected passenger's reservation was altered after she boarded, and your request is connected to that alteration. Claire looked around. This is because of who she is. Danielle finally answered. No. Claire turned. Danielle's voice remained low. This started before anyone knew who I was. That stopped Claire. Thomas looked at Danielle. Helen Price lowered her eyes. Even Richard did not move. Danielle continued. You put your coat on 2A before you knew my name. You decided I looked like an upgrade before you knew my name. You asked someone to move me after I boarded before you knew my name. Claire's face flushed. Danielle held her gaze. Whatever happens next doesn't change what happened first. No one had anything to add. The phone inside the cockpit rang again. Captain Bennett turned. Mark's radio crackled at the same time. Ellis, corporate security is requesting confirmation of passenger identity. Mark looked at Bennett. Bennett stepped back into the cockpit and lifted the handset. Captain Bennett. He listened. Yes. His eyes moved toward Danielle. Yes. Passenger confirmed. Another pause. Then he glanced at the brass tag again. Understood. He hung up slowly. When he stepped back into first class, every person in the cabin was watching him. Captain Bennett looked at Danielle, then at Claire, then at Rachel. His voice was quiet enough that everyone leaned in to hear. The call was not only about the seat. Claire went pale. Bennett looked back at Danielle. It was about who that protected passenger is. And for the first time that morning, the people who had been staring at Danielle began to understand that the name they were about to hear should never have been necessary. Captain David Bennett stood in the aisle with one hand resting lightly against the top of seat 1C. Nobody spoke. The first-class cabin had grown so quiet that Danielle could hear the steady rush of conditioned air above her head and the faint ticking sound of rain against the fuselage. Bennett looked at Danielle first. Not at the coat, not at Rachel, not at Claire. At Danielle. The protected passenger assigned to 2A is Danielle Carter. A few passengers shifted. The name meant nothing to some of them. It meant enough to others. Richard Whitmore's shoulders stiffened. The man across the aisle in 2D slowly removed his glasses. Claire stared at the captain. Yes, she said impatiently. We know her name. Captain Bennett's expression did not change. No, Mrs. Whitmore. I don't think you do. Danielle felt an old heaviness settle across her chest. She knew what was coming. She had spent years avoiding exactly this moment. The moment when a room that had ignored the facts suddenly discovered reverence because of a relationship. Bennett continued. Danielle Carter is the executive director of the Carter Community Technology Fund. Rachel Morgan blinked. Thomas Reed looked toward Danielle. Captain Bennett went on. And she is the daughter of Marcus Carter, founder and controlling chairman of Carter Meridian Group. The cabin changed. Not loudly. That was what made it so obvious. A businessman who had complained about his connection straightened in his seat. A woman near row 4 lowered her phone and stared. Mark Ellis looked toward Danielle with new calculation. Even Brendan Cole's supervisor shifted her posture. Claire did not move at all. Her face seemed too empty. Richard closed his eyes for a moment. "Claire," he whispered. She turned toward him. "What?" He looked at her as if she had just asked him to explain the weather. "Marcus Carter." "I heard him. You don't understand." Claire's voice sharpened. "Then explain it." Richard lowered his voice, but the cabin was too quiet to protect him. "Carter Meridian Group handles aviation infrastructure, freight operations, port logistics, ground systems. They have contracts across the country." He glanced toward Captain Bennett. "Meridian Crown works with them." Mark Ellis gave the smallest nod. Richard continued. "They're one of the largest privately controlled logistics groups in America." The color drained from Claire's face. Danielle watched it happen. There it was. The transformation. The same one she had watched years earlier when an executive realized the man he had mistaken for a delivery worker was Marcus Carter. Fear rearranged posture faster than conscience ever did. Claire looked at Danielle again. This time, her eyes did not travel to the white sneakers. They did not stop at the faded canvas tote. They did not dismiss the old brass tag. They went directly to Danielle's face. "Why didn't you say something?" Danielle's expression remained still. "About what?" Claire stared. "Who you are." Danielle looked down at her printed boarding pass. The paper still said the same thing it had said when she entered the aircraft. 2A. "My name was on this before you put your coat on my seat." Claire swallowed. "I didn't know who you were." Danielle lifted her eyes. "You didn't need to." The words moved through the cabin without force. They did not need force. Helen Price closed her eyes briefly. Thomas looked down. Rachel's face tightened as if Danielle had placed a mirror in front of her and refused to move it. Claire tried to recover. "You're making it sound like I deliberately targeted you," Danielle answered calmly. "You decided I looked like someone who could be moved. I was trying to sit with my husband. You were trying to sit with your husband by deciding my seat was less permanent than yours. I didn't know about the security designation. You didn't need to know that either." Claire's jaw trembled. Danielle held up the boarding pass. This was enough. No one argued. Captain Bennett looked at Rachel. Her voice had changed when she spoke again. "Ms. Carter, I want to apologize." Danielle turned toward her. Rachel stopped. The title had arrived too quickly. "Ms. Carter." Not ma'am. Not the passenger blocking the aisle. Not the woman asked to step into the galley. Danielle heard it. Rachel heard herself hear it. Danielle said quietly, "Please don't apologize because you know who my father is." Rachel's cheeks reddened. Danielle continued, "If you're going to apologize for what happened before you knew." Rachel lowered her eyes. "I understand. Do you?" Rachel looked back at her. For once, there was no easy professional answer. "I think I'm beginning to." Thomas's expression softened. Captain Bennett shifted toward Mark. "Corporate security wants complete preservation." Mark nodded. "Transaction history, gate scans, lounge requests, statements. Everything." Brendan Cole took a step forward. "Captain, I need to correct something for the record." Claire turned sharply. "Brendan." He looked at her, then at Danielle. His face was pale, but his voice was steadier than before. When Mrs. Whitmore came back to the lounge, she said the passenger in 2A looked like someone who had been upgraded at the last minute. Claire's mouth opened. Brendan continued before she could interrupt. She said Diamond members shouldn't be split up when an upgrade passenger could easily move. Richard stared at his wife. Danielle felt no surprise, only confirmation. Captain Bennett asked, "Did she identify Ms. Carter by name?" "No." "Did she know anything about her reservation?" "No." "Then what was that assumption based on?" Brendan looked down. "I don't know." Danielle spoke. "Yes, you do." Brendan looked at her. She did not attack him. That almost made the question harder. "What did she point to?" He swallowed. "She said you were traveling alone." Danielle waited. "And?" Brendan hesitated. Claire snapped. "You don't have to answer that." Captain Bennett turned. He does. Brendan took a breath. She said you didn't look like a full-fare first-class passenger. The sentence settled over the cabin. Not shouted, not dramatic. Just ugly in its precision. Helen Price's mouth tightened. Richard looked away from Claire. Rachel closed her eyes for half a second. Danielle did not move. There were moments when pain arrived hot. This one arrived cold, not because she had never heard versions of it before, because now everyone else could hear the rule that had been operating quietly from the beginning. Captain Bennett asked Brendan, "And you entered the request anyway?" "Yes, sir. Why?" Brendan looked toward Rachel. She had said we could try to keep Diamond members together when possible. Rachel's face changed. Brendan hurried on. "She never told me to move, Miss Carter. I made that decision." Rachel looked at him. "You used my general instruction to justify a specific override." "Yes. Twice." "Yes." Claire leaned forward. "This is absurd. Everyone is suddenly pretending they didn't know how premium service works. Diamond customers are accommodated all the time." Danielle turned toward her. "Not by taking something from someone else because you assume they won't matter." Claire's eyes flashed. "You think because your father is rich, you can lecture everyone in this cabin?" The irony was so complete that even Richard flinched. Danielle's voice remained quiet. "No. I think because I was assigned 2A, I had the right to sit in 2A." Claire stared at her. Danielle continued. "My father's money didn't print the seat number differently after you were wrong." Captain Bennett nodded once. That mattered. Mark Ellis touched his radio. "Captain, station management is asking how you want to proceed." Before Bennett could answer, the cockpit phone rang again. Everyone looked toward it. Bennett walked back, lifted the handset, and listened. "Yes." A pause. "Yes, Ms. Foster." Danielle's eyes sharpened. "Rebecca Foster. Her father's COO." Bennett listened for several seconds. "No. Ms. Carter has not requested removal of any passenger." Another pause. "Yes." "Understood." He hung up. When he returned, Danielle already knew what the call had been about. Captain Bennett looked at her. "Carter Meridian Corporate Security is requesting that all evidence related to the attempted reassignment be preserved. They are also asking whether you want company counsel notified." Danielle shook her head. "Not yet." Claire stared at her. "You can make one call and ruin people's careers." Danielle looked at her. There was fear in Claire's voice now. Real fear. The power had reversed completely. But Danielle felt no desire to use it carelessly. She looked at Brendan, at Rachel, at Thomas, at Helen, at Captain Bennett. Then back at Claire. "I don't want anyone punished because my father is Marcus Carter." Claire's expression shifted with brief hope. Danielle continued. "I want the record to show exactly what each person did before anybody knew his name." The hope disappeared. Captain Bennett studied her. "What are you asking me to do?" Danielle looked toward seat 2A. The buckle lay crooked against the leather where Claire's coat had struck it earlier. She reached down and straightened it with 2 fingers. Then she looked at the captain. "Treat me like the woman whose boarding pass said 2A before your phone ever rang." Bennett nodded slowly. Danielle turned toward Claire. "And treat her according to what she did when she thought I had no power at all." No one spoke. Outside the windows, rain continued tracing silver lines across the glass. Inside Flight 417, everyone finally understood the real danger of the captain's call. It had not made Danielle Carter powerful. It had made their earlier choices impossible to hide. And now the question was no longer who she was. It was what she would do with the power they had only just discovered. For several seconds, Danielle Carter said nothing. That silence made Claire Whitmore more nervous than anger would have. Anger could be called emotional. A raised voice could be criticized. A threat could be repeated later without context. But Danielle simply sat beside the seat Claire had tried to take, one hand resting near the battered CM-17 tag, while an entire first-class cabin waited to discover whether the billionaire's daughter would use her father's influence like a weapon. Captain David Bennett broke the silence. "Ms. Carter, I want to be clear. Any action I take will be based on the conduct we've documented here." Danielle nodded. That's exactly what I want. Claire leaned forward from 4C. Then this should be over. Her seat wasn't changed. She's still in 2A. Danielle looked at her. The sentence revealed more than Claire seemed to realize. Nothing counted, apparently, unless she had succeeded. Captain Bennett turned toward Mark Ellis. Read back what we have. Mark lifted the printed transaction record. Passenger. Danielle Carter boarded with a valid assignment for 2A. Passenger Claire Whitmore was assigned 4C. Mrs. Whitmore physically obstructed 2A with personal property and represented herself as entitled to that seat. Claire interrupted. I believed I was being accommodated. Bennett raised one hand. Let him finish. Mark continued. Premium Services agent Brendan Cole entered a manual reassignment request before boarding, then attempted a second reassignment after Ms. Carter had already scanned onto the aircraft. That second attempt triggered the protected reservation lock. Thomas Reed added quietly, Mrs. Whitmore also told crew Ms. Carter was in the wrong cabin before anyone verified the manifest. Helen Price spoke from 3D, and she made the full fare comment. Mark nodded. Witness statement will reflect that. Claire looked around the cabin. This is unbelievable. Richard Whitmore sat beside her, elbows on his knees. No, Claire. She turned. He looked exhausted. It's documented. The distinctions seemed to wound her. Captain Bennett faced Brendan. Mr. Cole, I need a formal statement before this aircraft moves. Brendan's supervisor handed him a blank irregularity form. His fingers trembled slightly as he accepted it. What exactly should I write? The truth, Bennett said. Brendan looked toward Claire. She stared back at him with a warning in her eyes. Danielle saw it. So did Bennett. Mr. Cole, the captain said, your statement is yours. No passenger influences it. Brendan lowered his head and began writing against the narrow galley counter. The scratch of his pen became strangely loud. Claire stood. Rachel Morgan immediately stepped toward her. Mrs. Whitmore, please remain seated. I need to speak to Brendan. No. I have a right to correct what he's saying about me. You'll provide your own statement. Claire looked toward Danielle. You're enjoying this? Danielle's face barely changed. No. Don't pretend. Danielle stood slowly. She did not step toward Claire. She simply rose beside 2A. You think power means making someone feel small because you can? Claire's expression hardened. Danielle continued. That's why you don't understand what I'm doing. Richard lowered his eyes. Claire laughed once, but there was no confidence left in it. You could have ended this 20 minutes ago by telling everyone who your father was. Danielle felt the old wound beneath those words. She remembered West Baltimore. Her father standing in a borrowed office during Carter Meridian's first financial crisis, wearing a work jacket because he had come directly from a freight yard. She remembered wealthy men discussing his own operating plan while one of them asked whether Marcus could bring in more coffee. He had been the man keeping their contract alive. They had seen the jacket first. Danielle had been 24, old enough to understand every insult and still young enough to believe exposing his wealth would somehow correct it. Marcus had stopped her. If they need my bank account before they can see me, he'd told her later, then they still haven't seen me. Now Danielle understood. She looked at Claire. If I had told you immediately, you would have moved the coat. Claire said nothing. You would have apologized. Still nothing. You might even have smiled. Danielle's voice softened. But not because I was right. Helen Price watched from across the aisle. Thomas stood motionless beside the galley. You would have done it because you were afraid of my name. Claire swallowed, and that would have left the real problem exactly where it was. Brendan's pen stopped. He turned from the counter. Captain. Bennett took the statement. Brendan spoke before anyone could read it. I wrote that Mrs. Whitmore said Ms. Carter looked like a random upgrade. Claire's face tightened. I also wrote that she asked me to try again after boarding started. Richard turned toward his wife. Brendan continued. And I wrote that I knew 2A was already occupied when I made the second attempt. His supervisor's expression fell. That was your decision? Yes. Did anyone instruct you to override a boarded passenger? No. Rachel stepped forward. My conversation with Brendan happened before boarding. I told him diamond passengers could be accommodated if legitimate availability opened. I did not authorize removing an assigned passenger. Danielle looked at her. Rachel met her eyes. But I also understand that my wording created room for him to think premium status deserved special flexibility. I'll put that in my statement. It was not absolution, but it was the first time Rachel had volunteered responsibility instead of defending procedure. Danielle nodded. Write it exactly that way. I will. Captain Bennett read Brendan's statement. Then he handed it to Mark. Attach it. Mark's radio crackled. He listened. Station management wants a recommendation. Bennett looked toward Claire. Claire rose again. Captain, before you do anything, I want to remind you that my husband has flown this airline for 17 years. Richard winced. Claire, stop. We spend a great deal of money with Meridian Crown. Danielle closed her eyes briefly. Even now, even with everything exposed, Claire was reaching for status as if status were evidence. Captain Bennett's expression cooled. Your husband's loyalty history is not relevant to your conduct. Claire stared at him. You would never be doing this if she weren't Marcus Carter's daughter. Danielle turned toward Bennett before he could respond. Then prove her wrong. Everyone looked at her. Danielle stepped into the aisle. Captain, if what Claire did would not justify removal for an ordinary passenger, don't remove her for me. Claire blinked. Danielle continued. Don't do it because Carter Meridian called. Don't do it because my father has contracts with this airline. Don't do it because someone is afraid of what Daniel Brooks might put in a legal letter tomorrow. Captain Bennett studied her. Then what standard do you want applied? The same one you would apply if my last name meant nothing. Silence. Danielle looked toward Claire. False claim to another passenger's assigned seat. Refusal to clear the seat when asked. Pressure on premium staff to change aborted passenger's assignment. A second reassignment attempt after boarding. Then continued interference while the crew tried to document what happened. Mark nodded slowly. Bennett looked at him. Does that record stand without the protected designation? Yes. Without Carter Meridian? Yes. Without knowing who Ms. Carter's father is? Mark looked at the paperwork. Yes, Captain. Bennett turned to Rachel. Operational recommendation? Rachel took a breath. Offload Mrs. Whitmore and refer the conduct for customer review. Claire stared at her. You cannot be serious. Rachel's face showed the cost of the answer. I am. Bennett looked toward Brendan's supervisor. Anything in the lounge record change that? No. Then Bennett faced Claire. Mrs. Whitmore, you will not travel on Flight 417. Claire's face went white. What? You're being removed from this flight based on the documented conduct that occurred before anyone confirmed Ms. Carter's identity. Claire looked at Danielle. This is what you wanted. Danielle shook her head. No. Then stop it. I asked them to judge what you did without my father's name. Claire's eyes shone with anger, and they did. Richard slowly stood. Claire. She ignored him. Captain Bennett spoke. Please gather your belongings. For a moment, Claire did not move. Then her hand closed around the camel-colored coat. The coat. The object that had started everything. She pulled it against her chest. Mark stepped toward the jet bridge. I'll coordinate rebooking instructions outside. Claire's voice cracked. I'm a diamond customer. No one answered. The words that had opened doors all morning suddenly sounded very small. Richard rose fully. Am I being removed? Mark checked the record. No, sir. Your conduct isn't part of the removal decision. Richard looked toward the empty 2B, then at his wife. Claire stared at him. You're coming with me. It was not a question. Richard's face carried disappointment, embarrassment, and something quieter that Danielle could not name. Finally, he reached for his briefcase. Yes. Claire stepped into the aisle. Passengers who had once stared at Danielle now moved their knees and bags to let Claire pass. No one smiled. No one applauded. Danielle was grateful for that. Justice did not need an audience cheering someone else's humiliation. Claire reached row 2, then stopped. For 1 second, Danielle saw an opening. A small human space where Claire could say the words that might matter. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Instead, Claire looked at Danielle and tightened her grip on the camel coat. I hope delaying an entire plane was worth proving your point. Danielle's eyes stayed on hers. The answer came quietly. I didn't delay this plane to prove who I am. Claire's jaw tightened. Danielle looked at the coat. I stopped you from deciding whose place mattered less. Claire stood frozen. Then Captain Bennett said her name. Mrs. Whitmore. She turned toward the jet bridge. Richard followed. Their footsteps disappeared into the hollow passage outside. Mark went after them. The cabin remained silent. Danielle sat back down in 2A. Her hands were tired. Her shoulders hurt. The power reversal everyone had been waiting for did not feel like victory. It felt like finally setting down something heavy. Thomas approached. Ms. Carter? She looked up. He held the crew tablet. Corporate security wants the preservation packet locked before departure. Danielle nodded. Good. Thomas hesitated. They're also asking for the names of every employee involved. Danielle looked toward Brendan. Then Rachel. Then Thomas himself. No scapegoats. Thomas frowned slightly. Ma'am. Write what each person did. Write what each person failed to do. But don't turn one employee into the whole story because that's easier for the company. Rachel heard her. Her expression changed. Danielle looked toward the open aircraft door where Claire had disappeared. This wasn't one coat. She touched her boarding pass. It was every small decision that made putting that coat there seem reasonable. Captain Bennett nodded. I'll make sure that goes into the operational report. Mark returned from the jet bridge with a Meridian Crown station manager walking beside him, a woman in a navy blazer carrying a tablet against her hip. Captain, Mark said. Rebecca Sloan. Station management. Rebecca Sloan, 50, looked first at Bennett, then Danielle, then the gathered statements. The incident packet is being locked now, she said, and corporate compliance has expanded the review. Rachel's shoulders stiffened. To what? Rebecca's eyes moved across the cabin. Not just Mrs. Whitmore. She looked at Brendan, then Rachel, then Thomas, then the witnesses who had waited before speaking. The review will cover the lounge decision, the attempted reassignment, the crew's initial response, and why a valid passenger was treated as negotiable before anyone knew her status. Danielle leaned back against 2A. Outside, rain ran down the window in silver threads. Claire was gone. But the harder consequence had just entered the aircraft. For the first time, the system itself was going to have to explain why Danielle Carter had needed power before people were willing to recognize proof. Rebecca Sloan stood in the forward galley with her tablet open, the blue-white screen reflecting against the silver trim of the service cabinets. At 50, she had the composed expression of someone accustomed to walking into operational failures after everybody else had already chosen a version of what happened. She did not begin with an apology. Danielle noticed that. Instead, Rebecca looked at Captain Bennett. I need confirmation that no records are being edited locally. They're locked, Bennett said. Lounge logs? Preserved. Gate scans? Preserved. Crew statements? Being completed. Passenger witnesses? Mark Ellis nodded toward Helen Price and the businessman in 2D. 2 confirmed, possibly more. Rebecca tapped the screen. Good. Claire and Richard Whitmore had already disappeared down the jet bridge, but the air they left behind still felt disturbed. Seat 4C stood empty. So did 2B. The camel-colored coat was gone. Yet Danielle could still see it across 2A if she looked too long at the leather cushion. An object did not have to remain in a place to leave its meaning there. Rachel Morgan approached Rebecca. What's the review category? Rebecca looked up. Protected passenger interference, unauthorized reassignment attempt, passenger seat interference, and crew response review. Rachel's face tightened at the last phrase. Crew response? Yes. I want it noted that once the protected designation became visible, I followed the required protocol. Danielle looked at her. There it was again. Once the protected designation became visible, the temptation to draw a line through the morning and begin responsibility at the point where Danielle became important enough to be dangerous. Danielle spoke quietly. And before that? Rachel turned. Danielle held her boarding pass between two fingers. Before anyone saw the lock, I showed this. Rachel said nothing. Rebecca watched the exchange. Danielle continued. Before anyone knew who Marcus Carter was, Claire's coat was covering my assigned seat. Rachel's lips pressed together. I understand that. Then put that before the security flag in the report. Rebecca's eyes dropped to her tablet. She began typing. Rachel looked at her. What exactly are you writing? Rebecca answered without looking up. Initial operational fact. Passenger Danielle Carter presented valid boarding pass for seat 2. A while seat was physically obstructed by another passenger's property. Danielle felt something inside her settle. Not heal, not yet, but settle. Rebecca continued. Crew response did not immediately resolve physical obstruction before treating matter as disputed assignment. Rachel inhaled, then let the breath out slowly. Yes. Thomas Reed stood nearby, holding his own statement form. Rebecca looked at him. Mr. Reed? Thomas straightened. I saw the coat before I checked the pass. Did you document that? I'm adding it now. Why wasn't it the first thing you acted on? Thomas looked toward Danielle. Because he could have said pressure. Because he could have said boarding congestion. Because he could have said senior purser authority. Instead, he answered, because Mrs. Whitmore sounded certain. The honesty made Rebecca pause. Thomas lowered his eyes, and Ms. Carter didn't. Danielle felt the old pain return in a sharper form. Not because Thomas meant that she had been unsure. He meant she had not performed certainty the way Claire had. Claire had occupied space loudly. Danielle had presented proof quietly. The cabin had mistaken volume for legitimacy. Rebecca typed, include that exact sentence. Thomas nodded. I will. A chime sounded near the aircraft door. Mark Ellis stepped onto the jet bridge, spoke briefly with someone out of sight, then returned. Whitmore rebooking is on hold pending customer conduct review. Rebecca nodded. Richard Whitmore? He chose to remain with his wife and deplane voluntarily. Danielle looked toward the open door. She pictured them somewhere near the gate podium now. Claire angry. Richard silent. For the first time all morning, Danielle wondered what happened after a public humiliation ended and a private marriage had to carry it. She did not wish them pain. That surprised her too. Consequences, yes. Pain for its own sake, no. Captain Bennett glanced at his watch. We're approaching the edge of our departure window. A groan came from farther back. Someone said, finally. Another passenger whispered, they should have just moved her in the first place, not quite softly enough. Helen Price turned in her seat. Moved who? The voice behind her went silent. Helen faced forward again. Danielle looked at the older woman. Helen had spent the first part of the incident watching. Now she seemed unwilling to let silence pretend it was neutral. Rebecca received an alert on her tablet. The incident packet is almost locked. Danielle looked at her. Almost? Brendan Cole's signed statement is uploaded. Mark's transaction record is uploaded. Passenger statements from 3D and 2D are uploaded. Captain Bennett's operational note is in. Rebecca glanced toward Rachel. I'm waiting on the purser statement. Rachel held the form against the galley counter. I've written it. Read the relevant section aloud. Rachel looked uncomfortable. Rebecca did not soften. Please. Rachel lowered her eyes to the page. At approximately 10:24 a.m., I responded to a first-class seating disagreement involving passengers Danielle Carter and Claire Whitmore. Danielle's expression changed. Rebecca noticed. So did I, Thomas said. Rachel stopped. Rebecca looked at Danielle. What wording would you dispute? Danielle answered. Seating disagreement. Rachel's shoulders stiffened. What would you call it? Danielle did not hesitate. Passenger obstruction followed by an unsupported competing claim. Rebecca nodded once. That's more precise. Rachel looked down at her statement. She crossed out a line. The scratch of the pen was small. It felt enormous. She started again. At approximately 10:24 a.m., I responded after passenger Claire Whitmore's personal property was observed blocking seat 2A, assigned to Danielle Carter, while Mrs. Whitmore asserted a competing entitlement to that seat without presenting documentation. Danielle said nothing. Rachel looked at her. That accurate? Yes. Rachel continued. I initially asked Ms. Carter to step into the galley before requiring Mrs. Whitmore to clear the obstruction. Her voice faltered slightly. I placed the burden of resolving the situation on the passenger who had already presented valid documentation. The cabin seemed quieter around them. Rebecca typed. Continue. Rachel swallowed. I did not recognize that imbalance quickly enough. Danielle looked at her. That sentence mattered more than a dozen polished apologies. Rebecca held out her hand. Rachel gave her the statement. Rebecca scanned and uploaded it. The tablet chimed. Packet locked. Captain Bennett's posture eased by 1 degree. Can we release the flight? Rebecca read the screen. Corporate security is clearing the operational hold, pending no new issue. Then she looked at Danielle. Ms. Carter, the record is preserved. No party can alter the original statements without an amendment trail. Danielle nodded. Thank you. Rebecca hesitated. There is one more thing. What? Corporate customer conduct has suspended Claire Whitmore's Meridian Crown premium privileges pending full review. Danielle felt no satisfaction. Rebecca seemed to expect a reaction. There was none. And Brendan? Removed from premium service escalation duties pending investigation. Not fired? No. Good. Rebecca looked surprised. Danielle glanced toward the jet bridge. If what he did was part of a larger culture, firing him alone would let everyone else feel clean. Rebecca's eyes sharpened. I agree. So investigate why he believed diamond pressure was more urgent than an assigned passenger's rights. I've already opened that question. Danielle nodded. That matters more. A boarding announcement crackled faintly from the gate outside. The remaining passengers were being released onto the jet bridge. Captain Bennett turned toward the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we have authorization to resume boarding. A collective breath moved through the aircraft, but no one applauded. No one cheered. The mood was too complicated for that. Passengers reached for phones. Overhead bins opened and closed again. The machinery of ordinary travel restarted. Thomas stepped aside to allow boarding through. As people entered, they glanced toward row 2. Some recognized Danielle now. Some did not. She preferred the ones who didn't. A middle-aged man paused beside her row. Ms. Carter? Danielle looked up. He smiled too brightly. I just wanted to say I think you handled that beautifully. Danielle felt exhaustion rise in her throat. Beautifully. As if being forced to remain composed while others questioned her right to a seat had been a performance. She gave him a small nod. Thank you. He moved on. Helen watched him go, then looked at Danielle. You hate that. Danielle almost smiled. What? When people congratulate you for not falling apart. Danielle looked out the rain-streaked window. Yes. Helen nodded. I would too. The simplicity of it comforted her more than praise. A few minutes later, the jet bridge began retracting. The door closed. Captain Bennett's voice came over the intercom. We've received a revised departure sequence and expect to push shortly. Danielle fastened her seatbelt. The buckle clicked. For the first time, she was fully seated in 2A. No coat, no argument, no one asking her to step aside. Thomas passed with a tray of water glasses. He stopped beside her. Ms. Carter. Danielle looked up. He set one glass on the console. I'm sorry. She waited. Thomas understood that the apology needed more. For waiting before I checked. Danielle held his eyes. He continued. I saw what was happening. I just thought Rachel would handle it. And then I let Mrs. Whitmore's confidence make me question what I had already seen. Danielle nodded slowly. Put that in your statement. I did. Then I hear you. Thomas swallowed. Thank you. He moved on. Rachel remained near the forward galley. Their eyes met. She did not approach yet. Danielle was grateful. Some apologies needed time before they became useful. Outside the window, the aircraft began to move. Wet pavement slid past beneath them. Service vehicles glowed orange through the rain. The terminal receded. For the first time since boarding, Flight 417 was finally going somewhere. But Danielle knew the harder journey had already begun. Claire had left the aircraft. The coat had left first class. The seat had been restored. Now everyone who had watched, hesitated, assumed, obeyed, or remained silent would have to decide what they were going to do with the truth once it was no longer possible to pretend they hadn't seen it. Flight 417 climbed through the gray Baltimore morning and broke above the clouds. Sunlight spilled across the wing in a sudden sheet of white and gold. Danielle Carter rested her head against seat 2A and watched the rain-dark world disappear beneath them. The cabin had become ordinary again. Coffee cups clicked softly against saucers. Seatbacks reclined. Phones disappeared into pockets. A businessman opened a spreadsheet as though nothing important had happened 20 feet away from him less than an hour earlier. That normalcy unsettled Danielle. Public humiliation had a strange way of becoming private exhaustion once the audience decided the scene was over. Her shoulders hurt. Her jaw ached from holding it steady. She rubbed one thumb along the folded edge of her boarding pass. 2A. The same number. The same paper. It had never changed. Thomas Reed came through the aisle after the seatbelt sign went dark. He stopped beside Danielle. This time, he did not carry the automatic smile of cabin service. "May I say something?" Danielle nodded. Thomas glanced toward the galley, where Rachel Morgan was organizing the first beverage cart. Then he looked back at Danielle. "I keep thinking about when you first walked up." Danielle waited. "I saw the coat." His voice was low. "I saw your boarding pass, too." Danielle looked at him. Thomas swallowed. "And I waited." "For Rachel?" "Yes." "Why?" Thomas thought about it. "Because Claire sounded certain." He shook his head slightly. "That sounds worse out loud. It sounds honest." Thomas gave a small, painful smile. "I told myself I was avoiding conflict, that Rachel had more authority, that boarding was busy." He looked toward the front of the cabin. "But the truth is, Mrs. Whitmore sounded like someone I was supposed to believe." Danielle felt the words settle differently now. Not as another wound, as an accurate description of one. "And I let that matter more than what I saw," Thomas said. Danielle folded the boarding pass again. "You put that in your statement?" "Yes." "Exactly?" "Exactly." She nodded. "Then I hear you." Thomas's eyes lifted. He had expected either forgiveness or punishment. Danielle offered neither, only recognition. That seemed to matter more. "Thank you," he said. As he stepped away, Danielle stopped him. "Thomas," he turned. "You told the truth when the pressure got worse." He waited. "That matters too." His shoulders loosened. "Not as much as telling it sooner." "No," Danielle said. "But it still matters." Thomas nodded and continued down the aisle. A few minutes later, Helen Price crossed from 3D. She held a small cream-colored card between two fingers. "Can I give you this?" Danielle took it. Helen Price, RRT, retired. A phone number was printed beneath her name. On the back, Helen had written a sentence in blue ink. "I stayed quiet once before. Not today." Danielle looked up. Helen stood awkwardly beside the row. "I wasn't always retired," she said. "My first hospital job was 37 years ago." She touched the seat back lightly. There was another respiratory therapist. Black woman, 31 at the time. Smartest one on nights. Danielle listened. Helen's face tightened with an old memory. She kept getting the worst assignments. Everyone knew it. Management always had a reason. Scheduling. Seniority. Personality. Helen shook her head. "I saw what they were doing." "What happened?" "She left." The answer came quietly. Helen looked toward the window. And once she left, everybody acted relieved. Like the problem had left with her. Danielle felt the weight beneath the confession. "You regret staying quiet. Every year." Helen looked at her again. "So when Claire said what she said this morning, I knew that feeling." Her fingers tightened around the seat. "And I still waited." You spoke before the record closed. Helen nodded. Late, but not too late. Helen's eyes softened. That is generous. No, Danielle said. It's accurate. Helen smiled. You really like that word. Danielle almost laughed. More than generous. Helen squeezed her shoulder lightly, then returned to 3D. Danielle placed the card inside her tote, beside the CM. 17 tag. Rachel Morgan arrived next. She stopped farther away than Thomas had. That distance told Danielle Rachel understood something had changed. Ms. Carter. Danielle looked up. Rachel held a folded sheet of paper. My amended statement. Danielle waited. I want you to know what I added. Rachel opened the page. I wrote that I treated Mrs. Whitmore's unsupported claim as something requiring investigation, while treating your valid documentation as something requiring additional proof. Danielle looked at her. Rachel continued. I wrote that I asked you to move before requiring the obstruction to be cleared. A pause. And I wrote that when the security designation appeared, I used procedure to defend a decision I should already have recognized was unequal. Danielle said nothing for several seconds. Rachel's eyes glistened slightly. Not tears. Fatigue. Shame. Fear of what the review would mean. I've been a purser 13 years, Rachel said. I'm good at this job. I know. The answer surprised her. Danielle gestured toward the cabin. I watched you after departure. You noticed the loose bin latch before anyone else. You helped the passenger in 1D without making him feel helpless. Rachel stared at her. Being good at parts of your job doesn't erase what happened. Danielle held her gaze. And what happened doesn't mean every good thing you've done disappears either. Rachel looked down at the statement. That makes it harder. It should. Rachel nodded. I thought you'd want me fired. Danielle shook her head. I want the review to be honest. What if honesty costs me my position? Danielle looked toward the wing. Then the decision should be based on what you did and what you're willing to change, not on making me feel powerful. Rachel absorbed that. Thank you. Danielle shook her head gently. Don't thank me yet. Rachel almost smiled. Fair. She folded the statement. I'm submitting the amendment as written. Good. Rachel stepped away, then stopped. Plainly should not have taken me this long. Danielle looked at her. No. Rachel nodded once and returned to the galley. The flight began its descent into Newark less than an hour later. The clouds broke beneath them, revealing warehouses, highways, rail yards, and long ribbons of wet pavement reflecting the afternoon light. Danielle watched the ground rise toward her. Her phone connected to the airport network before the aircraft reached the gate. 3 messages appeared. Rebecca Foster, Daniel Brooks, and Marcus Carter. She opened her father's first. Call me when you land. The second arrived seconds later. Proud of you. Angry too. Danielle stared at the words, then typed. I'm tired of proud being attached to this. She hesitated before sending it, then pressed the screen. Marcus replied almost immediately. I know. Nothing else, no lecture, no demand, no promise to fix everything. Danielle closed her eyes. Sometimes love was knowing when not to turn protection into control. Flight 417 reached the gate with a gentle jolt. Passengers stood almost instantly. Seatbelts clicked open. Overhead, bins opened. Rolling bags came down. Danielle waited. When the aisle cleared, Thomas stood at the forward door. Rachel remained behind him. Have a good afternoon, Thomas told the passengers ahead of Danielle. When she reached him, he stopped using the script. Compliance sent something to the gate for you. He handed her a sealed Meridian Crown envelope. Passenger copy of the incident packet. Danielle accepted it. Your statement still attached? Yes. Rachel spoke from behind him. Mine too. Danielle looked at her. Rachel met her eyes. No softer wording. Thank you. This time Danielle meant it. She stepped into the jet bridge. At the gate, Rebecca Sloan waited beside a corporate security representative and a compliance manager. Rebecca handed Danielle an incident summary. Protected passenger interference. Unauthorized seat reassignment attempt. Passenger seat interference. Crew response review. Danielle read each category. Witness statements? Attached. Original wording? Yes. Brendan? Removed from discretionary premium escalation pending review. Not terminated. Good. Rebecca nodded. We're also opening a station-level review of how diamond accommodation requests are handled. Danielle looked up. That's the part I care about. I know. Danielle closed the folder. Outside security, Marcus Carter waited. No entourage. No cluster of executives. No security wall. Just her father in a dark coat, silver showing at his temples, one hand resting on the handle of a small suitcase. He saw her. His face softened first, then hardened. Danielle walked toward him. Marcus did not ask what Claire had said. He did not ask who had been suspended. He did not ask whether Carter Meridian should call Meridian Crown's CEO. He asked one thing. You all right? Danielle stopped in front of him. For hours, people had praised her calm, her strength, her control, her dignity. With her father, she did not need to perform any of it. No, she said. Marcus nodded. Danielle held the sealed incident packet against her chest. But I'm clear. He looked at the envelope. About what? That what happened is written down correctly. Marcus's eyes moved to the faded Morningstar tote hanging from her shoulder. The CM17 tag rested against the canvas. He touched it once. You carried the old thing. Always. A tired smile crossed his face. Still ugly. You gave it to me. I was hoping you'd develop taste. She laughed. It came out smaller than usual, but real. Marcus smiled too. Then he opened his umbrella. Outside Newark, rain had started again. Danielle stepped beneath it beside him. Behind them, Flight 417 sat at the gate, its windows dark and ordinary. The seat had been restored. The truth had been recorded. The apologies had finally named the wound, instead of hiding it beneath words like confusion. But 3 weeks later, when a sealed review arrived in West Baltimore, Danielle would discover whether Meridian Crown had actually learned anything from what happened in 2A, or whether the system had simply become better at apologizing after it failed. Rain had returned to Baltimore. It fell softly against the windows of Morningstar Community Kitchen, turning the streetlights outside into long amber streaks across the wet pavement. A city bus sighed at the corner, doors folding open beneath a yellow shelter light, while adult workers stepped down carrying lunch bags, grocery sacks, and tired shoulders. Inside Morningstar, the evening air smelled of tomato soup, coffee, baked bread, and the faint metallic warmth of old radiators. Danielle Carter stood near the same stainless steel counter where she had served breakfast 3 weeks earlier. Her charcoal jacket hung over the back of a chair. Her white sneakers squeaked lightly against the tile. The faded canvas tote rested beneath the counter, and the scratched brass CM-17 tag tapped softly against one table leg whenever someone passed. A Meridian Crown envelope lay unopened beside her. Rebecca Foster, 55, stood across from her. The COO of Carter Meridian Group had arrived without assistance, without cameras, and without the corporate posture she wore in boardrooms. She had rolled up the sleeves of her dark blouse and spent the previous 20 minutes helping adult volunteers stack canned goods in the pantry before finally placing the envelope in front of Danielle. It came to your office, Rebecca said. Not my father's? Yours. Danielle looked at the envelope. That matters. I thought it would. Around them, volunteers moved through the warm room setting tables for dinner. Walter Green, 71, sat near the window, arguing cheerfully with Denise Walker, 64, about whether hot sauce belonged in tomato soup. It belongs on everything, Walter declared. Denise shook her head. You'd put it in coffee if nobody stopped you. Don't tempt me. Danielle smiled. Ordinary voices, ordinary warmth. No one here had ever needed to see a balance sheet before offering her a chair. She opened the envelope. The report was 23 pages. The first page carried the title, Final Corrective Review, Meridian Crown Flight 417. Danielle read in silence. Claire Whitmore's premium travel privileges had been suspended for 18 months. Any reinstatement would require completion of a customer conduct review and approval from Meridian Crown's corporate security and customer relations departments. Danielle paused. Rebecca watched her. You okay? Danielle nodded. I don't feel happy about it. You don't have to. She turned the page. Brendan Cole had received a final warning and been transferred out of discretionary lounge escalation duties. He had not been fired. The report stated that his actions were serious, but the review had also found that Meridian Crown's premium service culture had rewarded employees for solving Diamond member complaints quickly, even when policies were unclear. Danielle looked up. They named the culture. Rebecca nodded. Your insistence helped. Danielle returned to the report. Rachel Morgan had completed protected passenger protocol training and bias response review. Her purser duties had been temporarily suspended during evaluation, then restored under supervised review. Thomas Reed had received formal recognition for preserving accurate categorization and providing a statement that included his own initial hesitation. Danielle read that sentence twice. Not hero, not flawless, accurate after hesitation. That felt honest. Then came the larger changes. No premium lounge employee could request a post-boarding reassignment of a locked seat without seat control and supervisor authorization. Physical obstruction of an assigned seat had to be recorded as the first operational fact before any dispute classification. Exact passenger language had to be preserved when discriminatory assumptions were alleged rather than reduced to phrases like seating, misunderstanding, or interpersonal tension. Danielle stopped reading. Rebecca waited. Finally, Danielle said, They changed the order. The order? The first fact. She tapped the page. Before, the first fact became whatever explanation was easiest for the airline to manage. Now the first fact is what physically happened. Rebecca looked toward Danielle's tote. The code on the seat. Yes. Danielle closed the report for a moment. That matters more to me than Claire losing status. I know. A gust of wind rattled the kitchen windows. The front door opened. Marcus Carter entered carrying 2 cardboard boxes. No driver beside him, no security detail, no expensive overcoat over his shoulders. Just a dark sweater, work boots damp from the rain, and silver at his temples. Walter looked up. Well, look who finally decided to work for a living. Marcus grinned. I've been avoiding you specifically. You owe me soup. I own nothing in this building. That explains the soup. Denise laughed. Marcus carried the boxes to the pantry counter and set them down. Danielle watched him. For most of the world, Marcus Carter was a billionaire whose calls could stop executives mid-sentence. Here, Walter handed him a can opener and told him he was holding it wrong. Marcus accepted the criticism without protest. Rebecca leaned toward Danielle. He's happier here than at headquarters. He'd deny that. He'd be lying. Marcus finished helping with the boxes, then walked over. You read it? Danielle nodded. They did more than I expected. Enough? No. Marcus smiled faintly. Good answer. Danielle touched the old brass tag hanging from her tote. I learned something else. Marcus followed her gaze. What? Captain Bennett remembered this. Marcus chuckled. I'm surprised anyone does. He said you wore it during an emergency aviation shutdown. Marcus leaned against the counter. That was a long night. You never told me. You never asked. Danielle gave him a look. Marcus laughed. What? You want the heroic version? I want the real one. He looked around Morning Star. The warm light softened his face. When Carter Meridian was still small, we lost 3 major contracts within 6 months. Danielle listened. You know that part. Yes. What you don't know is how close I came to shutting the company down. Marcus looked toward the serving line. I was sleeping in the office some nights, eating whatever I could afford. His eyes moved toward the faded Morning Star logo on Danielle's tote. This place fed me. Danielle stared at him. Morning Star? 3 nights a week for almost 4 months. She looked at the tote, then the CM-17 tag. The 2 objects had traveled with her for years. She had known they mattered. She had never understood how deeply they belonged to the same story. Marcus touched the brass gently. I got that tag when I started coordinating field jobs myself. CM meant Carter Meridian. 17 was the equipment number they gave me because nobody thought the company would last long enough to need more than a handful. Danielle smiled. And now? Now lawyers charge me by the hour to explain what the letters mean. She laughed, then grew quiet. Marcus studied her. Do you wish you'd told them sooner? Danielle knew exactly what he meant. Who she was. Whose daughter she was. What Carter Meridian could do. She looked through the kitchen window. Outside, a bus hissed to a stop in the rain. An adult man in hospital scrubs stepped off beneath the streetlight and hurried toward Morningstar. Jacket pulled over his head. Inside, Walter was still arguing about hot sauce. Denise was pouring coffee. Rebecca was carrying bowls to a table. Danielle looked at her father. No. Marcus waited. Danielle touched the edge of the Meridian Crown report. Seat 2A was mine before anybody knew whose daughter I was. Marcus's face softened. There was pride there, but not the pride people had praised on the plane. This was quieter, personal. He nodded. Yes. That call changed how they looked at me. It did. It didn't change what the boarding pass said. No. It didn't change what Claire had done. No. Danielle looked down at the report, and it didn't create my dignity. Marcus smiled. No one gets to create that for you. A volunteer called from across the kitchen. Danielle, we could use another pair of hands. She stood. The report stayed on the table. Danielle tied on a Morningstar apron and moved behind the serving counter. Marcus joined her. The evening crowd entered slowly. Adult workers coming off shifts, retirees, home health aides, transit employees, warehouse staff, people carrying rain on their shoulders and long days in their faces. Danielle served soup. Marcus handed out bread. No one asked what their net worth was. No one cared which one of them could make a corporate phone ring. People were called by their names. Walter complained that his soup lacked courage. Denise told him his taste buds lacked judgment. Laughter rolled beneath the warm yellow lights. Danielle's phone vibrated in the pocket of her jacket. A Meridian Crown notification. Final corrective actions implemented. She looked at the screen, then turned it face down on the counter. The work mattered, but so did this. A room where worth was not assigned by seat number, clothes, loyalty status, or surname. Outside, rain traced silver lines across West Baltimore. Inside, Danielle Carter moved from table to table with a coffee pot in one hand and a stack of clean cups in the other. 3 weeks earlier, a camel-colored coat had covered seat 2A because someone had looked at Danielle and decided she was the easiest person to move. The captain's call had changed the flight. Her father's name had created attention. His wealth had created consequences, but neither had created her worth. That had been there before the coat, before the boarding pass, before CM-17, before anyone in first class knew enough to become careful. And as Danielle set a warm cup of coffee in front of Walter Green beneath Morningstar's soft yellow lights, she understood the lesson more clearly than ever. Human dignity does not begin when powerful people finally recognize it. It begins long before they enter the room. The only question is whether everyone else will have the courage to recognize it before a phone call forces them to. When do you think the real failure happened? When Claire took seat 2A, or when everyone else stayed silent? Danielle Carter never needed her father's name to make seat 2A hers. The boarding pass had already told the truth. What made her victory matter was that when the truth finally gave her power, she chose an accurate record over revenge. Dignity doesn't come from money, status, or having powerful people ready to make a call. It shows in how we treat someone when we believe they have nothing to offer us. The real test of character happened before anyone in that cabin knew Danielle was Marcus Carter's daughter. So today, if you see someone being dismissed while everyone else stays quiet, do one small thing. Confirm what you saw instead of assuming somebody else will speak. Danielle carried the truth alone until Helen finally stood up, and sometimes one calm witness is enough to change what happens next. So where do you think the greater failure happened? When Claire claimed Danielle's seat, or when the people around them saw what was happening and stayed silent? Tell me below, because I think the answer says a lot about what each of us would do in that cabin. And in the next story, another ordinary-looking stranger will enter a room where someone makes one very expensive assumption.